Hey everyone! This evening we're diving into some truly obscure corners of history, exploring places like monasteries, home kitchens, and private confession booths to reveal a part of the past that's been deliberately omitted from standard history books. We're discussing how women in the Middle Ages satisfied their own desires. Yeah, that's right. If you're looking for dry academic talks or gentle hints, you might not make it through, since what we're uncovering is raw, profoundly personal, and echoed over generations in scribbled notes on page edges and items stashed away under planks. So, before settling in, give the video a thumbs up and hit subscribe if you really like this content. And go ahead. Share your location and what time it is for you, particularly if it's after 1 a.m. No worries there. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and join me as we gently step into this exploration. Imagine yourself in a stone-walled enclosure in the rural English landscape. It's nighttime. The glow from candles dances, and you can nearly sense the quiet pulsing through the chilly corridors. This is a convent for women, perhaps from the 12th century, featuring arched stonework and aged wooden entrances. The air carries hints of sacred smoke, aged paper, and moist fabric. Beyond these walls, the outside world is filled with turmoil epidemics, battles, and the heavy hand of male dominance at its peak. Yet within, there are strict guidelines: quietude, order, purity, abstinence. But as you'll discover, such guidelines often sparked hidden behaviors. You trace a subtle giggle through the outdoor courtyard and glance into a room where nuns are meticulously duplicating manuscripts. A youthful sister, Juliana, looks up with a spark of mischief in her gaze. She's meant to be reproducing religious hymns, but concealed in her work is a piece from Ovid's Ars Amatoria, an ancient Roman guide to romance. The borders are adorned with tiny sketches, tendrils twisting like digits, produce cleaved in manners that jar the mind, and Juliana is fully aware of her actions. You see, even amid the presumed holiness of the nunnery, inquisitiveness smolders. These sisters, isolated from childhood, remained flesh and blood. They possessed physical forms. They harbored urges. They had ample moments alone, repetitive duties that allowed thoughts to drift. And drift they did. Juliana, much like her contemporaries among the nuns, could read and write. The religious institution promoted literacy for holy texts. But with the ability to read comes access to anything. Sensual verses, studies of the body, guides to plants, whatever evaded detection. Her preferred reading was a redacted edition of The Golden Ass by Apuleius, a Roman story with a striking episode involving a female character, a light source, and, well, some solitary exploration. The edges of those pages show wear. Interpret that however you wish. But let's ground this in context. Society during the Middle Ages, particularly the religious authorities, fixated on controlling sexual matters, especially women's enjoyment. It was regarded with doubt, even alarm. Self-satisfaction was deemed a transgression, a path to moral downfall, according to them. However, nuns maintained personal diaries. Few endured, but some did. A record from an abbey in 1311 recounts Sister Agnes whipping herself for impure ideas and contact, then enduring 3 days without food or speech. Yet, crucially, she documented it with such profound feeling and precision that it resembles a blend of admission and daydream. It prompts questions about whether the remorse fueled the excitement or the reverse, and that's the initial fracture in the flawless convent barrier. A researcher once discovered an unusual artifact in a sealed room of a dilapidated French nunnery. A sleek wooden rod bent at one tip with subtle Latin etchings. Beside it lay a set of prayer beads and a volume of the Vita Sanctae Gulinae. It has never gone on public exhibit. Institutions struggle with how to categorize it. Religious artifact is the tactful phrase, but truthfully it resembles less a spiritual accessory and more a practical means of introspection. The intriguing detail, the Latin phrase roughly means, "My flesh is the Lord's orchard, and I will cultivate it by myself," encapsulating the essence. For certain women, notably those in seclusion, a whole sentimental and divine structure revolved around their connection to their physiques. They navigated a contradiction, rejecting cravings while fixating on them, chastising themselves for impulses that were purely natural. Such internal strife didn't invariably quash enjoyment. Occasionally it heightened its allure. Academics have debated this for years. Some contend we're overinterpreting fragments, imposing contemporary views on ancient psyches. Others maintain the evidence is too uniform to dismiss the mix of concealed romantic writings, admissions in journals, items with unclear purposes. It forms an image, perhaps not perfectly sharp, but undeniably a colorful patchwork, showing how females navigated toward their own yearnings, even amid the harshest constraints. You exit the copying room and enter the convent's secluded greenery. The plants release a pungent aroma into the twilight, sage, rue, and an earthy sweet note you can't identify. Juliana's tone echoes in your mind like a hymn. She's still duplicating psalms, sure, but her thoughts are far away, perhaps with a prohibited volume, perhaps beneath her robe, and it dawns on you that this wasn't a solitary whim. It was a subtle defiance, a personal haven shaped from skin and imagination. The barriers enclosing them were stone, but within those barriers, women continued to envision, contact, yearn, and indeed, pleasure themselves. It transcended mere wrongdoing. It was about endurance. You return to the stone passage, the atmosphere thick with sacred aroma and ages of unspoken matters. You're lingering on Juliana, her concealed writings, her subtle illustrations, and the subtle passion in the edges of her holy labor. But now you're venturing past the nunnery's boundaries into the broader society where transgression wasn't merely a murmur in the sanctuary. It was an outright communal display. If you believed self-enjoyment was tricky within isolated gates, prepare for the church's outward stance. Welcome to the medieval era where all's prohibited, particularly what folks covertly relished. The religious institution took desire seriously. Any intimate conduct beyond wedlock and even within, if overly zealous, was questionable. But self-pleasure stood as a distinct moral hazard. For females, it wasn't simply immoral. It was against nature, a symbol of chaos, a breach in the sacred shield of womanhood. The formal doctrine was unambiguous. Craving was for males, purity for females. The woman's form was intended to be submissive, accommodating, compliant. You're not meant to crave. You're meant to assist, bear children, or remain unmarried. Those were the choices. Hardly abundant. Theologians were fascinated by passion, and by fascinated, I mean they dwelled on it in writing so extensive they make today's online discussions seem mercifully concise. Saint Jerome, a prominent figure in early Christian philosophy, described a monk plagued by visions of dancing females. He suggested starvation and self-punishment, typical medieval remedies for the spirit. But what if the one desiring isn't a monk, but an idle spouse or isolated widow? Abruptly, it's less about preserving her essence and more about reinforcing control. And this is where irony deepens. The religious body penned so much on transgression depicting it, cautioning against it, detailing precisely what to avoid, that they inadvertently crafted a medieval manual on intimacy. It's akin to instructing someone to avoid picturing pink elephants, then feigning shock when they envision entire herds. A well-known 13th century guide for penance, essentially a cleric's manual for doling out consequences, positions female self-touch alongside infidelity and animal relations. The punishment: abstaining from all but bread and water for 40 days. But intriguingly, the document devotes multiple sections to outlining how a woman might perform the act, what items she could employ, and how often. Suspiciously comprehensive, Reverend. Now, picture an everyday woman absorbing this. Perhaps you're a young girl in a modest hamlet, a trader's spouse, or a widow owning her residence, a scarce privilege. You attend confession, and the priest poses very pointed inquiries about your solitary activities. Even if you weren't engaged before, now the notions swirl in your thoughts like mist. That's no coincidence. This is where we halt for the evening's peculiar detail. In the 14th century, a documented instance in Italy involves a cleric so fixated on women's admissions that he authored a private manual for uncovering concealed wrongs. It featured queries like, "Do your hands drift beneath your attire at night?" and "Have you applied force between your legs while envisioning a man?" This bordered less on divine counsel and more on mild erotic questioning. He was ultimately ousted from his role for improper conduct, though accounts don't specify if he faced discipline or merely relocation to another area. Typical medieval oversight. But this sparks the discussion. Were these cautions and documents mere projections? Did the religious leaders truly view women as boiling pots of uncontrollable passion, or were they fostering that notion to rationalize greater dominance? Certain experts suggest the clergy's preoccupation with female craving stemmed more from their personal insecurities than reality. Others propose we undervalue how authentically frightened medieval folks were of physiques in general, women's in particular, monthly cycles, labor, excitement, all perceived as chaotic, perilous, and religiously dubious. So if a woman relished her form, even privately, she wasn't merely violating a directive, she was upending the established hierarchy. In your imaginative journey through time, you float across a hamlet marketplace. It's trading day. You overhear chatter and chuckles, poultry clucking, the tangy odor of spices and perspiration. Amid the activity is a modest wooden stall for Sunday confessions. A queue of women forms. Some grip beads, others appear timid. You catch fragments of murmured regrets, jealousy, idleness, tainted notions. But nobody utters the term self-pleasure. It's too intimate, too laden with disgrace. Yet you sense it's present, lingering like sacred fumes, unvoiced but intensely experienced. You stroll with one afterward. Her name is Aldith. She's the child of a grain processor with calloused palms and eyes that have witnessed more than her age warrants. She chuckles freely, but there's strain beneath. You inquire delicately if she ever senses temptation. She smirks. Temptation? What do you suppose occurs when snowfall traps me inside for days and my mother visits relatives? You arch an eyebrow. She dismisses it. If the divine didn't intend for me to experience it, why place the sensation there? That simple phrase captures the unspoken defiance women embodied daily. They weren't foolish. They recognized their feelings. They knew the cleric's words. And yet they discovered methods to inhabit their forms, to contact, to sense, to envision, even if they never voiced it louder than a murmur. The disgrace was systemic, but the enjoyment was individual. As you depart the hamlet, the sun sinks below the ridges, the bells toll, summoning folks to worship. You glance at the modest stall where transgressions were evaluated and penalties assigned. But Aldith is home already, likely slicing vegetables or sharing laughs with her siblings. Later, when the flames dim and the dwelling quiets, perhaps she'll recall that sensation, that gentle buzzing essence within, and perhaps she'll honor it, not as wrongdoing, but as a personal mystery belonging solely to her. The following dawn arrives with avian melodies and moisture. You emerge from Aldith's recollection and into a tight passageway behind a herbalist's store, one redolent of mashed blossoms, sour liquid, and a faintly animalistic note. The establishment is disordered and packed. The racks sag under containers, marked in ancient script and unfamiliar icons. Parched clusters dangle from the rafters like dormant creatures. Lavender, mugwort, yarrow, and in a distant nook sits a female, pulverizing something into a deep green mixture. Her name is Letitia. She's neither a sister nor a cleric, nor anyone with official authority. Yet much of the community seeks her when they require items too awkward to request from the religious. Letitia understands women's needs, not merely offspring or alleviation from pains or a method to curse a disloyal partner. She comprehends craving, the sort that originates deep in the gut and descends, smoldering gradually. Most females lack the vocabulary to articulate it, but they arrive with reddened faces and clumsy inquiries. What can I use to aid rest? They inquire, gazes averted, something to soothe the jitters. And Letitia provides. She invariably does. One of her top items is a mixture of damiana, cloves, withered rose blossoms, and a dash of cantharides, known as Spanish fly, though nobody mentions it aloud. Not because it's outlawed, not at that point, but because it functions excessively well. A single gulp, and your flesh heats. A few droplets under the tongue, and abruptly your physique recalls its depths, cravings, pulses. Naturally, the amount is crucial. Excessive and it's hazardous. Insufficient and it's merely ornate infusion. Letitia is cautious. She's observed women depart and return radiant, slightly less tense, slightly more alert. And here's the day's peculiar note, damiana, that modest plant. It served as a stimulant dating back to the Aztecs, but by the later medieval times it appeared in European plant guides under ambiguous phrases like rousing of the uterus, heating of the lower regions. A 15th century document portrays it as a tonic ideal for sorrowful young women, which frankly is just period jargon for females needing enjoyment without an avenue. Letitia doesn't function in isolation. Across the Middle Ages, birth attendants, plant experts, and so-called sage females possessed the genuine insight into the physique, particularly the female one. This insight wasn't invariably documented. It was murmured, transmitted from parent to offspring, from mender to learner. And portions of it concerned enjoyment. Yes, they understood preventing conception or prompting it, but they also knew easing migrating uteruses, quieting frantic mists, and relieving the buildup in solitary spouses and fatigued servants. Here's where the historical discussion intensifies. Some experts contend that these plant treatments were merely unintended effects of addressing female ailments. Others assert the women certainly knew their intentions, and that phrases in ancient documents like reviving the essence or reinstating warmth to the core were subtle disguises for inducing stimulation or even pique. Because honestly, when a formula includes fennel, cinnamon, honey, and ongoing rubs to the lower midsection, it's not solely about swelling. You sit opposite Letitia now, sipping something heated and spiced. She arches a brow. You entered for remedy for coughs, she teases, but perhaps you're seeking another thing. Her tone is gentle, but there's a perceptive sharpness. And suddenly, you're drawn into a concealed past, a subtle web of women who have perpetually recognized that the physique is not merely a container for agony, but a wellspring of strength. Letitia reveals a small volume, encased in supple hide and marked by age. The sheets are packed with formulas, one for spasms, one for fruitfulness, one marked solely with a half moon and the term glimmer. What does this achieve, you inquire? She grins but offers no reply. Instead, she immerses her digit into a tiny container of ointment and applies it to your arm. The fragrance is captivating. Amber, citrus bloom, something deeper. Your flesh prickles. The space feels somewhat warmer. This is the closeness often overlooked in historical accounts. Not monarchs in conflicts and antique pacts, but females solitary or united, pursuing enjoyment in veiled manners, with plants, with heated rocks, with ingenious applications of fiber or sculpted items exchanged covertly at dusk. The external society declared they weren't supposed to experience craving, much less pursue it. But in the seclusion of their cooking areas, yards, and communal sleeping quarters, they constructed an alternative reality. You express gratitude to Letitia and depart with a modest fabric-bound package, secured with cord and discretion. Outside, the hamlet hums with ordinary existence, animals, rumors, soiled paths. But you bear something timeless and profoundly challenging, awareness that enjoyment is not merely feasible but yours to seize, and that other females ages ago did likewise. As you proceed, the aroma of plants clings to your flesh. You contemplate the innumerable women who requested slumber aids or uterine soothers, fully aware of what they truly obtained. And you grin because the past didn't obliterate them. It merely murmured them into annotations and obscurity. But they're still present in the fragrance of Damiana, in the bite of clove, in the arc of a perceptive grin shared among women who perpetually knew more than expected. And this evening, somewhere behind a closed pane, another female will ignite a light, unwrap a package, and claim her enjoyment softly, but not isolated. You depart from Letitia's herbal shop and feel pulled toward the hamlet's border, where the stone trails dissolve into turf and the foliage thickens. A meandering route guides you to a modest dwelling nestled in the forest, nearly engulfed by creeping vines. Within resides a woman named Wolfhild. And no, she's not a mender or a sister. She's a fabric maker. But upon entering her abode, You recognize she may comprehend the physique as thoroughly as any plant specialist. The atmosphere is heated, dense with sheep grease, colored threads, and something subtly metallic like warmed rocks post-rainfall. You observe her instruments, wooden rods, plush fleece, fabric samples suspended from rafters, and something additional. A glossy rock formed oddly, provocatively. Wolfhild spots your gaze and smirks without remark. Welcome to the realm of resourceful creativity. Wolfhild resides solo, which is uncommon. Her spouse passed years prior, and she never wed again. The community murmurs about her, mainly in tones tinged with jealousy and bewilderment. Some claim she converses with foliage. Others say she crafts talismans with excessive skill. But the most enduring whisper is that she's satisfied, unruffled, emanating a serene contentment. And for females in the Middle Ages, that bordered on sorcery. She provides a seat and some heated ale, and you observe her operate the weaving frame. Her palms shift with a cadence that borders on mesmerizing. Each yank and draw of the strand buzzes like a pulse. "Have you ever sensed it in your core?" she inquires abruptly, gaze fixed on her task. That longing, that deep blaze. You affirm, uncertain if she's metaphorical. She's not. That's when she displays her assortment, not solely weaving implements, but for solace, arousal, and exploration. A hollowed shaft from an aged rod, sleek as stream pebble, a bent fragment of maple, eroded at one extremity, a cotton sack stuffed with heating plants, intended to be warmed by the flames and slipped beneath garments. None bear labels. None are discussed openly, but they're all crafted, intentional, evidently utilized. Here's the unusual historical snippet. There are medieval lists from certain homes, particularly widows, that itemize personal belongings without specifying their true nature. Occasionally they're termed privates or female instruments, or simply timber objects of minimal worth. But excavators have unearthed a few preserved in marshlands and beneath flooring. And let's acknowledge they're molded in forms that spark little doubt. Now, whether these artifacts were genuinely for personal satisfaction or served some alternative ceremonial or therapeutic role, that's where academic opinions clash. Some experts maintain they were health devices for addressing hysteria or promoting childbearing. Others contend that if it appears like a phallic substitute and conceals like one, it likely wasn't for mixing stew. The reality probably lies midway. Versatile items in a society that forbade women from admitting their wants, even privately. Wolfhild reveals she began testing at 17, following her sole encounter with a male that left her more perplexed than fulfilled. He grunted and turned away. She dismisses it. So I began sorting it out myself. It wasn't defiance, she states. It was endurance, isolation, mental stability. You believe males are the sole ones restless at night? Her gaze sparkles with amusement. You rest by the flames as she illustrates warming the cotton sack in the embers, then encasing it in gentle wool to press against her midsection on chilly evenings. At times it's merely comfort, she whispers. Other moments it evolves into more. She doesn't expand, and you don't require her to. The space conveys it. Outside, owls hoot afar, and the blaze snaps gently. Wolfhild reclines, her features illuminated in warm hues. You can worship and still comprehend your physique, she remarks. They're not adversaries. They simply use different tongues. And there lies the phrase that shatters ages of hush. Because despite the religious body's dire alerts and all the societal restraints imposed on women's forms, the bodily sensation of enjoyment wasn't eliminated. It was redirected, repurposed, and occasionally concealed within items that to untrained observers appeared utterly ordinary. Let's discuss tactile elements because they counted then too. The feel of wool on bare flesh, heated from the fire. The force of a curved timber form squeezed between legs under sheets of fabric. The aroma of heated plants, clove, fennel, and a hint of musk. These weren't mere sensory notes. They were instruments of endurance for women whose existences were frequently dictated by others' decrees. When enjoyment couldn't be asserted openly, it was etched in secret into horn, rock, timber, and recollection. The academic dispute over these artifacts persists. Some historians minimize them as rarities or misconstrued health equipment. Others embrace the notion that medieval women possessed a vibrant, though concealed, intimate existence, where self-satisfaction was recognized, engaged in, and conveyed in murmurs. The mere survival of these items suggests they were cherished, concealed, and maybe even lamented when misplaced. You thank Wulfhild and venture into the darkness. The air's cool now, but you sense an odd warmth unrelated to the flames. Perhaps it's from realizing that even in the toughest periods, women discovered paths to connect with themselves through material and timber and rocks that retained the form of delight. Perhaps it's the awareness that the instruments of that delight were perpetually visible, just masked as something else. The dwelling fades among the trees, but her words persist. You can worship and still comprehend your physique. That's the overlooked reality, not of defiance or disgrace, but of subtle independence, of women fashioning enjoyment with whatever was at hand, rod handles, heating rocks, or their own steady palms. You're not ready to depart the forest yet. Something about Wulfhild's assurance, her serene embrace of solitude and fulfillment, clings to you like fumes in your attire. But this evening, your route curves back to the stone barriers of another convent, one far more elaborate than Juliana's modest enclosure. This one is richer, located near a thriving commerce path, its grounds verdant and meticulously maintained. The panes are inlaid with tinted glass that captures the lunar glow like jewels and rubies. Inside, the atmosphere hints at floral essence, wax from bees, and the faint mold of antiquity. Here, amid the facade of regimen and daily devotion, women were documenting emotions they weren't supposed to harbor, let alone disclose. In this specific convent resided a sister named Gazella. Her writings didn't persist formally. No ornate bound volume showcased in a state repository, but scraps of her diary were unearthed years ago, concealed within the empty binding of a decaying prayer book, inserted there like a remorseful message. The material is bleached, ripped, marred by moisture, but readable in spots. And what it discloses, let's acknowledge, isn't all Ave Marias. You kneel next to the candle-illuminated table in Gazella's old quarters. The area is sparse, merely a pallet, a timber seat, a vessel, and a modest cross. But it's what resided in her mind that counts. The diary pieces describe nocturnal appearances, not of holy figures or fiends, but of warmth, of visions that leave her breathless, of a shameful delight in the shadows that she concurrently pleads for pardon and aches to reprise. One uneven, tilted line states, "I punish myself, but still discovered bliss." May the Lord pardon the body he bestowed. It's unfiltered, conflicted, somewhat tragic, and it narrates a profounder tale because Gazella wasn't isolated. Throughout the medieval era, there's a whole genre of literature historians term erotic mysticism. And sure, that resembles a contemporary music release, but it's actually a style where descriptions of holy union are conveyed in blatantly sensual and occasionally intimately explicit terms. Consider saints panting in rapture, being impaled by Christ's affection, undergoing surges of sacred ecstasy that coincidentally resemble, well, climaxes. Take Saint Teresa of Avila's subsequent writings, for instance. Though she's after the medieval period, her impact resonated backward. She depicts being penetrated by the seraph's blazing spear, her form trembling, her essence dissolved in holy affection. Medieval visionaries prior to her established this foundation. Hildegard of Bingen, Mechthild of Magdeburg, and yes, numerous unnamed women in religious houses all reported physical responses to divine encounters. Shaking limbs, fiery cores, rapid pulses. It poses a challenging, uneasy query that experts have grappled with for decades. Were some of these women directing suppressed intimate emotions into mystical expression? Or were their forms simply responding naturally, unavoidably to extended seclusion, emotional fervor, and an existence focused on yearning? The discussion is genuine. Some contend labeling these feelings sensual disrespects their faith. Others assert disregarding the sensuality is what diminishes their humanity. Because truthfully, if your whole self is constructed around pining for something you're forbidden to physically contact, that pining will emerge somewhere. Here's your edge fact for the night. In one 14th century nunnery in present-day Germany, a sister was found to have composed not only pious verses, but also elaborate correspondence to a fellow nun, detailing vivid visions, bodily feelings, and veiled allusions to private instances shared. The messages were concealed in a hollow, behind the sacred table, and only uncovered ages later during repairs or were too deteriorated to decipher. But others endured. They brimmed with symbols, orchards, entrances, streams, lips, the type of composition that only appears pure if you're striving intensely to overlook the intent. This evening, as you rest on Gazella's chilly timber seat, you can nearly sense the fervor of those women's internal realms. Hours of hush, repetition, denial, and beneath it all, a physique that declined to silence. The religious body declared the form a container of transgression. These women inhabited it regardless, and occasionally they contacted it, not in revolt, but in earnest pursuit of tranquility or alleviation, or some murmured, inexpressible form of delight. The religious institution naturally attempted to restrain all this. They suppressed anything hinting at sensuality. Sisters were barred from sharing beds. Contact, particularly nocturnal, was monitored by senior women termed guardians, nuns designated to patrol sleeping areas in case anything unhallowed transpired under the covers. But you can't oversee a vision. You can't observe what occurs behind shut lids, and you certainly can't prevent someone from uncovering in the solitude of her own quarters how to locate the tender spot where the longing melts into something heated and voiceless. The final readable line is, "I will utter no more of this, but I will recall." Was? It's ambiguous if she was discovered, admitted, or merely ceased documenting. But the mere act of writing reveals everything. She experienced craving. She pursued it, and she noted it not as dirt, but as an element of her religious conflict-deserving record. You depart the convent just before daybreak. The chimes haven't sounded yet. The world pauses its breath, and the light in Gazella's quarters flickers once more behind you. Her tale is merely one among hundreds, perhaps thousands of women who employed religious expression to handle bodily necessity, who muddled the boundaries between rapture and pique, who discovered methods, however subdued or veiled, to understand themselves within skin the religious body instructed them to dread. And though we'll never learn all their identities, their sighs resonate in the stone hallways, their mysteries folded into devotion volumes, their delight concealed openly. You exit the convent, the stone barriers engulfed by morning haze, and traverse meadows just starting to sparkle with moisture. The stillness of those isolated existences vibrates in your frame, but now you're directing toward something vastly different, somewhere far less holy and far more shocking. This evening, or rather this dawn, you're delving between the sheets of volumes not intended to endure, the ones incinerated, prohibited, or encased in plain bindings and placed under false headings. You're entering the overlooked archives of the Middle Ages. Yes, they possessed those, and opening manuscripts with pigment still vivid and purposes still simmering. Because, believe it or not, medieval women consumed erotic material. Now, it's not as if they had a shelf-tagged, steamy nun escapades nestled between saint biographies and farming guides, but sensual writings existed, frequently brought in, often masked as antique or symbolic texts, and they circulated among literates and among illiterates who had a companion to recite it softly after dusk. The distinction between amusement, instruction, and arousal wasn't as defined as one might assume. Consider The Romance of the Rose, for example, a vast 13th century French symbolic poem that begins innocently. A youth falls for a lovely rosebud. Charming, correct? Except the rosebud clearly represents female anatomy. The entire narrative turns into an elaborate symbol for courtship, opposition, and ultimate triumph. And it was immensely favored, so favored that women perused it, replicated it, shared it, annotated it in the borders with semi-humorous, semi-outraged remarks. There's even a recorded instance of a noble female, Marguerite of Navarre, who not only consumed such tales, but composed her own. Her anthology, Heptameron, is essentially a medieval fusion of the Canterbury Tales and tales of domestic intrigue. Narratives of ardor, disloyalty, craving, and longing presented from various female viewpoints. Some experts claim she was critiquing the double standards of male intimate liberty. Others suggest she was voicing female imaginings. Regardless, her tales endured because they were framed under the honorable guise of ethical teaching. You had to peer closely, but the intensity was there. And then there are the volumes nobody wishes to address. In 2008, a manuscript from the 14th century was uncovered in the supports of a larger legal tome. Parchment, recycled, crammed into a spine for reinforcement. The revealed segment, a poetic story about a woman named Isabel, who, after being confined in a tower by her envious spouse, seeks comfort not in devotion, but in a sleek apparatus presented by a servant. It's ambiguous enough to evade instant suppression, but straightforward enough to eliminate uncertainty about the events. One line reads, "Her digits knew the cadence as well as any musician's grasp." Well, then here's your edge fact for the day. There's conjecture that specific crafts guilds, particularly those of copyists and decorators, produced sensual artwork on commission for discreet purchasers, not for open view, of course, but to be inserted into folders and concealed under bedding. In one uncommon case, a border illustration in a book of hours depicts a nun pursuing a phallus on legs. Yep, a literal penis with legs. It's not subtle. And while scholars debate whether it's satire or smut or some twisted moral allegory, the vibe is unmistakably cheeky. Someone somewhere found that funny or stimulating. Now, you might be thinking, but weren't most women in the Middle Ages illiterate? Fair point. But here's the twist. Noble women, nuns, and urban merchant-class women were often literate, especially in larger towns. Reading wasn't always academic. It was social, sensual. Books were read aloud during embroidery sessions, in bed, or while tucked away behind drawn curtains. One late 13th century account even tells of a group of nuns disciplined not for reading illicit texts themselves, but for allowing local girls into the convent to hear them read from French romances of excessive sweetness. That's a poetic way of saying they were reading sexy stories to guests after Vespers. But the debate rages on. Some scholars argue that we're misreading all this, that we're seeing sexual intent where none existed, that metaphors like the rose or the key and lock are just innocent allegories for spiritual longing. And yes, that's possible. But when those metaphors show up again and again, always attached to female readers, always circled or underlined or echoed in private notes, it's hard not to see a pattern, a longing not just for divine union, but for flesh and blood intimacy. Let's not forget that these women weren't reading in a vacuum. Their entire lives were structured around restraint. Physical desire was either ignored, punished, or pathologized. So when a story came along that even hinted at satisfaction, however veiled, it landed like a lit match on dry straw. Imagine it. You're a widow with no husband to scold you, sitting in your candlelit chamber, the curtains drawn. You open a book gifted by your cousin in Bruges. It's handwritten, carefully illustrated, and smells faintly of cloves and old leather. You turn the pages slowly. The story is about a woman trapped, tempted, torn between duty and longing. And then, tucked inside a folded scrap, a hand-copied poem in French, she touched where no eyes dared to stray. And in the dark, she found her day. Your finger lingers on the page. Your breath shallows. You know you're not supposed to feel like this, but here it is. A story written for you, or someone just like you. Proof that you're not alone, that someone else, a woman with ink on her hands and fire in her heart, knew what it was like to reach down alone in the dark and not feel shame, but a kind of quiet triumph. So, no, erotica wasn't a modern invention, and women didn't start enjoying themselves in secret with the rise of paperback romances. They were doing it in castles, convents, and candlelit chambers centuries ago, with ink, imagination, and the will to find themselves in stories too dangerous to name. The real miracle is that any of those stories survived at all. By now, you've wandered through convents and kitchens, poetry and herbs, whispered fantasies and carved curiosities. But tonight, you're crossing a much darker threshold. The air smells different here. Damp earth, smoke, something acrid, almost like iron. You're entering the shadowy world where female pleasure and power collided with fear. This is where the story shifts from secrecy to danger. Because for many women, the line between knowing their own bodies and being labeled a witch was thin, frayed, and often fatal. Let's start with the obvious question. Why was female sexuality so threatening that it ended up tangled with sorcery? The answer, as always, starts with control. In a world built on rigid hierarchies, God over man, man over woman, church over body, any woman who stepped outside of passivity was a problem. If she knew how to heal herself, that was suspicious. If she spoke confidently about the body, even more so. But if she took pleasure in that body, if she used that knowledge to feel good on her own terms, well, now you're into dangerous territory. Take the case of Sibylla, a midwife in the mid-15th century who lived near what's now Alsace. She was known in her village for being too direct, for never marrying, and for helping women in matters of the flesh. She brewed teas, massaged bellies, offered tinctures for pain. She also kept a small stone phallus wrapped in red cloth that she used quietly for treating women with what was then called uterine hysteria. You can guess what that actually meant. Her neighbors gossiped, then accused, and Sibylla was tried for witchcraft, not because she summoned demons, but because she laid hands upon women's lower regions and stirred unnatural heat. That was the phrasing used in the testimony. She was executed. Here's your quirky historical fact. The infamous Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, the late 15th century guidebook for identifying and punishing witches, includes entire sections obsessing over female sexuality. It claims with absolute confidence that women are more lustful, more deceitful, and more prone to carnal sin than men. One particularly unhinged passage describes how witches inflame the loins of others by the mere touch of the hand. Not exactly peer-reviewed science, but very telling. The fear wasn't just about magic. It was about women owning their own desire. You're starting to see a pattern, right? The church couldn't fully erase female pleasure, so it rebranded it, framed it as something foreign, demonic, outside the natural order. If a woman's body hummed with heat and joy, it had to be because she'd made a pact with the devil or a forest spirit or a goat for some reason, anything except her own agency. But here's where things get murky. Some women did mix pleasure and ritual, not because they worshiped dark forces, but because the line between medicine, spirituality, and sensuality wasn't clearly drawn. For example, in parts of rural France and Italy, fertility rites involved women bathing together, chanting prayers, anointing their bodies with oils. And yes, sometimes using carved objects passed between them to awaken the womb. These rituals were centuries old, rooted in pre-Christian traditions that the church absorbed, repackaged, or tried to erase. For the women, they were sacred, healing, maybe even ecstatic. Scholars argue about what exactly was happening during these rituals. Were they communal acts of empowerment, religious ceremonies with sensual overtones, or just misinterpreted folk practices? No one agrees. The sources are fragmented, often recorded by men who had no idea what they were actually witnessing or who twisted it deliberately. But what's clear is this: the further a woman stepped from sanctioned roles, the more her pleasure became a threat. Picture this: a woman dancing alone in the woods at dusk, her hair loose, her feet bare in the dirt. She has herbs in her satchel, scars on her hands, and stories the priest doesn't like. If she touches herself under the moon, It's not because she's cursed, it's because she knows herself. That was enough. Inquisition records show that many women were accused not just of casting spells, but of arousing themselves or others through unnatural means. One case tells of a widow named Agnes who kept a devil's toy carved from bone and who supposedly used it during Sabbaths to entertain the flesh. There's no evidence she harmed anyone, but the object itself, proof that she sought pleasure without male permission, was all it took. The toy was burned along with her body. Let's take a breath because, this part is heavy. And yet, through all of this, the trials, the gossip, the danger, women still found ways. They passed knowledge in hushed voices, shared tools under cloaks, hid items in wool crevices and inside mattress seams. One historian uncovered a tiny bundle of linen stuffed in a chimney of a 14th century cottage in Wales. Inside, a smooth wooden cylinder, a dried sprig of rosemary, and a prayer scroll addressed not to God but to Our Lady of Comfort. No one knows her name, but we know what she valued: warmth, scent, sensation, a moment of control in a world that offered none. The debate continues today. Were these women rebels, victims, survivors, magicians in disguise, or sensualists misunderstood? Some say we should stop trying to label them entirely, that what matters isn't how we categorize them, but how we listen to the traces they left, scorched, hidden, whispered. You step away from the fire now, leaving behind the smoke and ashes of too many burned names. And yet you carry something with you, a deep understanding that pleasure for many medieval women was a dangerous act of resistance. To touch yourself in a world that told you your body wasn't yours, that was magic. The real kind. The kind no one could ever fully extinguish. You're walking through the thick fog of early morning now. And with each step, the world feels heavier, not just from what's come before witch hunts, whispers, burnings, but from what still hides in the cracks of this era. There's one more place you have to visit before sunrise. It's smaller than a village, quieter than a convent, and somehow more intimate than both. Tonight, or rather this morning, you're stepping into the confessional, more specifically, into the space between the priest's questions and the woman's trembling voice. Because if you want to understand how medieval women experienced their own bodies, you need to listen not just to their desires, but to their confessions. Picture this: a simple wooden booth. The air smells of wax, mildew, and something sharper, fear. You're kneeling on the worn floorboards, the priest's silhouette just beyond the thin screen. You hear his breath before his words. Then comes the question, asked in Latin, French, or crude dialect, but always with the same tension. Have you touched yourself? It's not phrased quite like that, of course. It's usually couched in religious jargon. Have you entertained impure thoughts in solitude? Have you stirred your own flesh to sin? But the meaning is crystal clear. And across centuries, thousands of women answered, sometimes with silence, sometimes with tears, and sometimes with hesitant, shame-laced honesty. Which means the confessional, while designed to crush desire, also accidentally preserved it. You're reading one such confession now, tucked into an old manual used by parish priests in rural Spain. The handwriting is sloppy, probably copied by a tired cleric, but the story it records is vivid. A young girl, not yet 17, admits to pressing herself against the post of her bed during sleepless nights. She doesn't name it. She doesn't understand it, but she says it brought warmth, then shame. The priest marks her penance, 20 Hail Marys and fasting on Fridays. But between the lines, you can almost hear the girl's confusion. Her body felt something it wasn't supposed to, and instead of answers, she got punishment. This is where the real struggle played out, not just in secret acts of pleasure, but in the emotional aftermath. Because medieval women were taught that their bodies were not only sinful, but treacherous. Their desire was painted as something external, invasive, a temptation sent by demons or born from original sin. They were told their wombs wandered if not filled, that their fluids were cold and dangerous unless regulated by sex or childbirth. So when they discovered pleasure on their own, it wasn't liberating, it was terrifying. And yet they kept doing it. Why? Because instinct overrides ideology. Because the body doesn't care what the bishop thinks. Because sometimes curiosity simply wins. Here's your fringe fact of the night. In a 13th century penitential guide from Flanders, priests are instructed to probe gently when questioning women to avoid arousing further sin through the inquiry itself, which is medieval code for don't get too detailed or you might give them ideas. The absurdity, of course, is that the very act of grilling someone about their masturbation habits is going to put the idea front and center. It's like telling someone not to imagine a naked saint. They're going to picture a naked saint, probably in detail. But the confessional wasn't just a site of punishment, it was also a twisted kind of catharsis. For many women, it was the only place they could speak of what they felt, even if it came with shame, even if it led to fasting, lashes, or isolation. At least they could say it out loud. There's a kind of relief in naming the thing, even if you whisper it through tears. You pause your walk now, finding yourself inside a small stone chapel on the edge of a crumbling town. The pews are empty, the air still. You sit in the dark, imagining the thousands of voices that pass through these walls, all speaking the same forbidden truths in different dialects. A peasant girl from a nearby farm who rubbed against the churn and wept after. A young noblewoman who confessed to dreams that left her soaked and shivering. A nun who admitted to restless nights and wandering hands, only to be moved to another abbey entirely. These weren't isolated moments. They were patterns, echoes, a quiet chorus of bodies longing to be heard, even as they were taught to be silent. And here's the kicker. Most priests didn't know what to do with these confessions. Some assigned harsh penances, some brushed it off. And some wrote it down, not out of compassion, but fascination. Some even kept sin diaries, cataloging the most lurid confessions. One such record, kept by a priest in 14th century Florence, included entries like a girl of 14's frequent self-defilement using candle stubs, and a woman of 35 admits to using the base of a crucifix. The tone is clinical, detached, but the fact that he recorded it again and again suggests something more than concern, maybe curiosity, maybe projection. Maybe both. The scholarly debate here is messy. Some historians argue that we overinterpret these confessions, that the Church's obsession with sin doesn't reflect what people actually did, just what authorities feared. Others counter that the consistency of these records proves a lived reality. Women were masturbating frequently, desperately, despite the shame, despite the risk. And why wouldn't they? Pleasure was one of the few things they could experience that wasn't dictated by a man. You didn't need permission. You didn't need a husband or a priest or a social position. Just a quiet moment, a hidden corner, and a little imagination, maybe a piece of smooth wood or the edge of a bed, maybe nothing at all. Back in the chapel, you trace your fingers over the stone floor, worn smooth by centuries of knees and secrets. You imagine the last woman who knelt here. She might have been praying for forgiveness, or maybe just for understanding. Maybe she whispered her confession through the screen, heart pounding, hoping the priest wouldn't hear the real weight in her voice. And maybe once she'd said it, she went home and did it again, not because she was wicked, but because she was human. The sun's climbing now, turning the sky from gray to gold as you leave the chapel behind. It's still early, but you feel like you've lived a dozen lives already. Juliana and Gazella, Wolfhild and Aldith, their secrets heavy in your pockets. But now it's time to step beyond the hearth and the abbey walls to where dust clings to your hem and blisters bloom on your feet. You're going on pilgrimage, not just in the spiritual sense, but in the deeply human one. Because medieval women didn't just travel for relics or redemption. Sometimes they walked hundreds of miles just to feel something they weren't allowed to name. Pilgrimage, on the surface, was a sacred journey, a long trek to a holy site undertaken to earn spiritual merit or atone for sin. And for women, it was one of the only socially acceptable reasons to leave home, move through the world alone, and brush up against strangers without raising suspicion. In theory, these journeys were about prayer and humility. In practice, they offered something far less pious and far more tantalizing: freedom, anonymity, the kind of solitude that lets the mind and hands wander. You're walking beside a young widow named Marjorie. She's headed for the shrine of St. Thomas Becket, a long and dusty trip from her home in Devon. She's grieving, or so she says, but as the road stretches behind her, she admits that she's also just curious. "I want to know what I'm made of," she tells you, eyes bright under her travel hood. "I've spent my life being touched. I wonder what it's like to touch myself." It sounds simple, but in her world, it's radical. You camp that night near a roadside inn, the stars blinking through the smoke of other pilgrims' fires. Marjorie rolls her cloak into a pillow and lies back with a content sigh. "I dream more now that I'm alone," she murmurs. Not all of them are holy. She grins at the sky like it's in on the joke. She's not ashamed, not exactly, but there's a thrill in the secrecy and a strange permission that comes from being just another face among many. And she's not the only one. Historical records tell us that women on pilgrimage often formed brief, intense bonds, sisters in walking, praying, and sometimes sinning. They shared food, shared blankets, shared stories that would have earned them lashes back home. And more than a few of those stories included confessions of heat that rose between thighs after long days on foot. One account from a 15th century Italian priest complains about wayward women pilgrims who lay alone too long and allowed their idle thoughts to breed devilish desires. He was scandalized, but also weirdly specific. Makes you wonder what he really saw or imagined. Here's your quirky historical footnote. At some shrines, vendors sold wax offerings shaped like body parts: hands, feet, hearts, and yes, genitals. Officially, these were offerings for healing, symbolic representations of ailments to be cured by the saint. But sometimes the wax figures were oddly exaggerated in detail. One particularly well-preserved example from a French site shows a pair of female legs spread with something disturbingly lifelike nestled between them. It's been labeled anatomical offering, but the imagination fills in the rest. So, what's the debate here? It's all about intent. Were these women acting out quiet rebellions through sacred ritual, or were these just strange little coincidences in a deeply symbolic world? Some historians argue that we're looking at medieval people through a modern lens, that we're reading sex into everything because we think about it constantly. Others point to the frequency, the consistency, and the sheer specificity of some of these records and say, come on, there's no way they didn't know what they were doing. You lean toward the latter, don't you? Let's say you're a woman with a life mapped out since birth marriage, childbirth, hard work, silence, and then for once you're alone. You walk for days, your body sore, raw, real. You feel it again in a way you haven't since girlhood. The curve of your hip as you wash in a stream, the pulse between your legs after miles of stepping over rocks and roots. You find yourself slipping a hand beneath your shift one night just to touch the ache that's grown there. It's not sinful. It's not even deliberate. It's instinctual. Your fingers know more than you do. Marjorie tells you she's brought something with her. A small, cloth-wrapped stone, smooth from river water, that she keeps tucked in her bag. Helps with back pain, she says with a wink. But later that night, when the camp is quiet and only the insects hum, you hear the softest sound from where she lies. A slow, barely audible breath drawn through teeth, a whisper of movement. She's tending to herself in the dark on a holy road. It's not sacrilegious. It's sacred in its own way. Pilgrimage offered women like Marjorie space to explore themselves, both spiritually and physically. It gave them time, distance, and a reprieve from constant surveillance. And for many, that freedom translated directly into the body. Touching themselves wasn't always about lust. Sometimes it was about finding the edges of their own skin, reclaiming sensation in a world that expected them to go numb. And let's not forget the shrines themselves. While official church doctrine tried to keep things clean and orderly, many pilgrimage sites developed reputations for being less than wholesome. There are accounts of excessive devotion pilgrims fainting or writhing at the feet of saints, sometimes in what we would now recognize as states of religious ecstasy. And sure, some of that was genuine awe, but some of it looked suspiciously like physical release, especially when the stories started surfacing about women who recovered from hysteria after visiting particular altars and bathing in certain holy wells. Imagine that traveling halfway across the country, offering a wax vulva to a saint, bathing in sacred spring water, and then lying in the dark, stroking away the years of silence and shame. If that's not spiritual healing, what is? You continue walking beside Marjorie, the road dusty beneath your feet and the horizon shimmering with light. She's humming now, low and steady, her fingers grazing the strap of her satchel. You don't ask her what she's thinking. You already know. She found herself somewhere along this road, not in a shrine or a sermon, but in the heat of her own hand, in the dream she didn't confess, in the stone that fits just right. And she's not going back. The road continues, winding past bushes and hedges and low stone fences, till the spires of another town rise in the haze ahead. You've traveled far by now through cloisters and kitchens, fields and firelight. But as you approach the town square, something shifts. This place smells of burnt sugar, wet leather, and politics. It's louder, full of trade and tension, and you can feel eyes watching from behind shutters. This is a town caught between sin and salvation, and at the center of it all stands the towering figure of Saint Agnes, carved in pale stone, her expression frozen somewhere between agony and rapture. Tonight you're walking the blurred line between sainthood, sin, and sensuality, because medieval women weren't just imagining pleasure in secret, they were witnessing it in their saints. The divine and the erotic weren't always opposites. Sometimes they shared a bed. It sounds wild, but hear this. Countless hagiographies, those are the official lives of the saints, contain descriptions that sound more like feverish love letters than holy biographies. Female saints in particular are often described experiencing physical ecstasy. They swoon, they shudder, they fall to the floor in tears, trembling with what the texts call divine joy. And if that all sounds suspiciously familiar to you, yeah, same. Take Saint Catherine of Siena, a 14th century mystic, deeply revered, canonized within a century of her death. Her most famous writings include descriptions of a mystical marriage to Christ, in which she receives an invisible ring, symbolic, yes. But she also writes of feeling pierced by love, overcome by sweetness, and seized by trembling. Her confessor describes her lying still for hours, her face flushed, her breathing shallow. It was called holiness. But let's be real. If that same scene were written in a modern novel, it would come with a steamy warning. Even more striking is Saint Teresa of Avila, though yes, she technically lived after the medieval period. Still, her influence was already forming. Her vision of being pierced by a flaming arrow from an angel, her body writhing with divine bliss. She literally wrote, "The pain was so intense that I moaned aloud." Yet, it was not bodily pain, but spiritual delight so sweet that one never wishes it to end. The line between spirit and body didn't just blur, it completely dissolved. Now, here's the quirky wrinkle. For centuries, many of these descriptions were taken completely at face value. Holiness was seen as something that could be so intense it overwhelmed the senses. But in recent decades, scholars have started asking, was that really all it was? Some suggest these women were channeling unexpressed sexual energy into religious devotion. Others argue that we're projecting modern ideas backward, that these saints were simply swept up in emotional intensity. But the undeniable fact, many of these mystical experiences involved the body. They were described in the language of arousal. They weren't just theological, they were visceral. And what about the women reading these stories? Imagine you're a merchant's daughter. You've just been given a devotional manual by your aunt, meant to keep you pious, obedient, chaste. Inside, you find the life of Saint Agnes, who reportedly refused a marriage proposal, ran into the woods, prayed for divine union, and lay trembling in the moss, overcome with warmth. You read it again and again, and something stirs. You're not thinking about doctrine. You're thinking about that warmth, that trembling, that moss. Because maybe these stories weren't just instructions. Maybe they were invitations. Some nuns reportedly read the lives of the saints, not just for spiritual growth, but for comfort. And comfort in a world where every form of bodily autonomy was stripped away could easily become desire. The most radical part, in those rare moments when a woman's physical longing was framed as mystical, it was respected, even venerated. No one questioned St. Teresa's gasps or Hildegard's visions or Mechtild's burning belly. So maybe, just maybe, women started folding their real flesh and blood longing into the language of the divine, not to deceive, but to survive. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. There are documented cases, scattered, half erased, of women performing rituals in front of saintly icons that look suspiciously sensual. Candles placed between thighs, prayers whispered with hands pressed low. A priest in Cologne wrote a furious sermon about women who fell into raptures before the Virgin's altar and touched themselves in their robes, claiming to feel divine warmth. He tried to ban the practice, but it kept happening, which leads to the big scholarly debate. Were these women faking religious ecstasy to experience pleasure without punishment, or were they genuinely feeling something that was both sacred and sensual? Some historians argue that we're trying too hard to separate the two, that in the medieval mind, spiritual and bodily experiences weren't always at odds. A woman didn't have to choose between the bedroom and the chapel. Sometimes they overlapped. You wander the edge of the town square now, watching the bustle slow as dusk approaches. You pass a candlemaker's shop where a young woman stacks molds shaped like hands and hearts, but also other suggestive forms. One could be a limb or something more private. She catches your eye, smirks, and doesn't explain. She doesn't need to. There's a quiet understanding there. Back at the shrine of St. Agnes, a line has formed. Women of all ages kneel at her feet praying. Some sob, some smile, some sit perfectly still. One woman leans forward, places her forehead against the cold marble, and stays there a little too long. Her shoulders shake, not in grief, but something else. She walks away lighter. This is the space medieval women carved out for themselves between the holy and the hungry, a place where they could long, reach, tremble, and still be seen as good, faithful, worthy. They knew the rules, and they found the cracks. They wrapped desire in velvet language, placed it in the mouths of saints, and let it live. And maybe later that night, after the shrine is dark and the candles have burned low, that same woman will lie in her narrow bed, fingers exploring the divine geography of her own body, whispering prayers with every soft sigh, not as rebellion, not even as release, but as recognition. She is not separate from the sacred. She is sacred. The streets of the town are quiet now, the day's merchants long packed up, carts creaking homeward and shutters drawn tight. You're moving past the cathedral, past the bells that keep everyone's lives stitched to a schedule, and into the winding back lanes where the real stories breathe among the timbered homes of merchants, bakers, and housewives. Tonight, you're stepping into one of those homes, not noble, not poor, just ordinary. Because if you want to understand how medieval women pleasured themselves, you can't just look at saints and sinners. You have to sit at the kitchen table, stare into the stew pot, and listen to the woman who stirred it. Her name is Alice, and she lives 3 streets from the market in a narrow house with ivy creeping up the bricks and a drying rack full of onions above the hearth. She has 3 children, a husband who travels for business, and the look of someone who hasn't had a moment to herself in a decade. But when the house sleeps, when the shutters are latched and the fire is nothing but warm coals, she changes. She stops being a provider, a cleaner, a caretaker, and becomes something else entirely, someone who remembers her body still belongs to her. The concept of housewife is so often flattened in modern memory. But back then, it came with complexity. These women ran households like empires. They brewed beer, kept accounts, bartered cloth, doctored wounds, and raised children with no help but their own hands. They were resourceful, exhausted. And here's the thing, they were often alone. Alone during the day while the men worked the fields, alone during long business trips, alone in the long silent hours of a snowed-in night. And where there is solitude, desire is never far behind. Alice doesn't say much. She doesn't have to. You see it in the way she straightens the linen on the bed when no one's watching, how she places the oil lamp in just the right corner to cast a gentle, warming glow. She tells you her favorite time of year is early spring, not because of the weather, but because of the privacy. With the kids helping outside and her husband at the port, the afternoons are hers. She doesn't read Latin, doesn't write poetry, but she knows what feels good, and she's inventive. Alice shows you a drawer. Inside, small scraps of softened leather, a rounded bit of driftwood polished smooth by river water, a pouch of dried lavender mixed with chamomile, and a whisper of mint. Helps with nerves, she says, though her smirk says otherwise. These aren't tools of rebellion. They are tools of survival, little rituals for the body when the world demands too much from it. Here's your fringe fact for the evening. In some medieval marriage handbooks, yes, those existed. There are entire chapters devoted to how women should endure sex with their husbands, not enjoy, endure. Yet between the lines, advice sneaks through. Prepare the bed with warmth and oils, one 14th century guide advises. Let her recline gently and breathe deeply, for her pleasure quickens her womb. That last part, if you caught it, is the loophole. If a woman's enjoyment was seen as helpful to fertility, then suddenly it was permissible, even encouraged. So Alice plays along. When she touches herself at night, she sometimes tells herself it's medicinal, preventative, necessary. She doesn't need a scholar's footnote to justify it, but she's savvy enough to use one if she ever got caught. Keeps the blood from going sour, she jokes, and it's quicker than waiting for God to answer a prayer. Outside, the wind stirs the shutters, and a soft creak echoes through the rafters. Inside, Alice is settled under her wool blanket, one hand wrapped around a warmed pouch of herbs, the other drifting with purpose. She's not hiding from herself, not anymore. Let's pause here because this is the part of the story that rarely makes it into history books. Most of what we know about medieval female pleasure comes from religious documents, medical texts, or accusations, basically men's commentary on women. But Alice's story isn't in any record. It's preserved in the smoothness of her driftwood, the faint perfume in her drawers, the muscle memory in her fingertips. You can't archive that, but it's real, and it challenges the narrative. This wasn't about sin or scandal or even sleep. It was about returning to the body after a day of serving others, returning to sensation after silence, returning to a version of herself that didn't ask for permission. Scholars have debated whether peasant and merchant-class women had time or space for self-pleasure. They were too busy, some argue, too constrained by duty. But that argument forgets one thing. Even the busiest lives have cracked slivers of time when no one's watching, when the house is still. And in those moments, the body whispers. Alice listens. She tells you softly that she first discovered pleasure as a girl, accidentally, during a bath. The way the water moved, the way the heat pulled low in her belly, it startled her. She thought she'd done something wrong. She didn't tell her mother, but she remembered. Later, she learned to chase that feeling. Not often, not obsessively, but just enough to remind herself she was alive. It wasn't until years later, after childbirth and years of marriage, that she needed it again. This time, not out of curiosity, but out of survival, to feel herself again beneath the layers of obligation. So now, when the chance comes, she lets her hands wander. She knows what makes her body sing, and when she finishes, she breathes, not in guilt, not in fear, but in relief, in reclamation. This is the version of history no one teaches you, the one without martyrdom or miracle. Just a woman in a small town, in a small bed, and more for remembering what it feels like to belong to herself. A woman who doesn't need Latin or liturgy to justify her pleasure. She just needs time, and when she gets it, she takes it. It's near midnight now, and the hearth fire in Alice's house has burned down to a soft red glow. You slip out quietly, leaving behind the scent of mint and smoke and the gentle breath of someone who has finally claimed a sliver of rest. The streets are empty, slick with dew, and the town feels like it's holding its breath. But you're not headed home just yet. There's one more door waiting to open tonight, and behind it lies a different kind of power. One practiced with clean hands, sharp tools, and ancient knowledge. The midwife's domain. You find her in a house that doesn't quite look like a home. There's no family bustling around, no husband warming his feet by the fire, just shelves, crates, jars, and a woman in her 40s, sleeves rolled, apron stained, her fingers smelling faintly of vinegar and thyme. Her name is Mara. She's delivered dozens of babies, stitched dozens of tears, and laid out dozens of the dead. People trust her or fear her, or both. Either way, they come. But what they don't know or don't say aloud is that Mara has also kept another set of knowledge, not just about childbirth or fever, but about pleasure, about the moments in a woman's life when her body doesn't ache or bleed or stretch to accommodate others, but tightens with her own desire. And she shares that knowledge carefully, in whispers and hands-on guidance disguised as treatment. Tonight she's seeing a young woman named Lynette, newly married, pale with embarrassment. She came under the pretense of irregular bleeding, but once the door closes, her real reason stumbles out. "I can't finish," she says, cheeks blazing. "Not with him, not by myself." I thought maybe something's wrong. Mara doesn't laugh. She never does. She simply nods, draws the curtain, and pulls down a small leather pouch. Inside are herbs, yes, but also something else, a soft bundle of cloth, a smooth, curved object made from antler and wrapped in waxed linen. Mara calls it the moonstone, though it's neither a stone nor magical. What it is, however, is tried and true. "Let me show you how to listen," she says gently, "and your body will speak. This right here is the hidden legacy midwives carried, decoded beyond blood and bone. They weren't just healers, they were keepers of erotic anatomy. They knew what books didn't teach, what priests refused to name. They touched, examined, comforted, and yes, educated. And often that education included pleasure. Let's talk fringe fact. In a 14th century manuscript on gynecological health, translated from Arabic medical sources, there's a short, careful passage describing how to relax the womb through stimulation. It outlines the process in clinical terms. Massage the lower abdomen with warming oil. Apply gentle pressure. Allow release. It stops just short of calling it what it is, assisted orgasm. And who is performing these treatments? Midwives, quietly, compassionately, and often repeatedly. Some historians bristle at the idea. They argue it's anachronistic to assume medieval midwives understood or encouraged masturbation, that these treatments were just misinterpretations of hysteria, relief, or fertility techniques. But others say the pattern is too clear. The objects found in apothecary kits, the repeated mentions of womb massage, the coded notes in herbal texts, it all suggests a deeper, tactile wisdom, one passed from hand to hand, not pen to page. Back in Mara's cottage, Lynette listens carefully. She watches, she mimics. Her breath quickens. She's not being violated, judged, or rushed. She's being taught, not by a lover fumbling in the dark, but by another woman who knows exactly how the body blooms under its own touch. When Lynette finally finds that moment, the soft gasp, the inward curling, she cries. Not because it hurts, but because it doesn't. For the first time, pleasure feels safe, feels hers. Mara says nothing, just hands her a warm cloth and a packet of herbs to take home. Use this when the world makes you forget what you are, she says. And just like that, a life changes. You sit with Mara after Lynette leaves, the candlelight flickering off jars filled with dried roots and hand-carved tools. They all think I just birth babies, she mutters. There's no official record of this side of midwifery, no sanctioned scrolls, no statues or stained glass tributes. But if you read between the lines of medical texts, if you open the hidden drawers in dusty cottages, you find the traces. A broken comb filed into shape, a jar of oil that smells more like jasmine than medicine, a hand-sketched diagram of the pelvis with parts labeled in a mix of Latin and local slang. Nothing academic, everything human. The debate, as usual, splits down familiar lines. Was this knowledge widespread or rare? Did women like Mara share openly or only with those desperate enough to ask? We may never know. But the very fact that such knowledge existed, rooted in care, in empathy, in bodily autonomy, is proof of something powerful, something enduring. Mara tells you she once treated a noble woman who traveled 2 days in secret to find her. She said she hadn't felt anything in 5 years, Mara recalls. Not even when she tried, not even in her dreams. By the time she left, she was humming under her breath. You leave Mara's house just before dawn. The air has that peculiar weight it gets right before a storm dense, charged, ready to break. You know you've just witnessed something profound, no less so for being entirely unsanctioned, a passing on of knowledge not recorded in ink, but in sensation, in trust, in the fingertips of women who had no books but knew the shape of pleasure better than any scholar ever would. And somewhere across the town, Lynette lies awake in her marital bed, one hand wrapped in cloth, the other pressed low, discovering that she is not broken after all, that there is nothing sinful about knowing herself, that she doesn't need a priest's pardon to feel whole. She just needed someone to show her the way back. You're walking again, this time down a muddy path that weaves out of town and into the edge of the woods, where everything feels a little more ancient, a little less watched. The trees hang close here like gossiping neighbors. Moss covers everything that doesn't move, and even some things that do. You're headed toward something unspoken, something left out of most official records, but very much present in the lives of medieval women. Because now it's time to talk about the object that everyone pretended didn't exist, even as it passed from hand to hand in the dark. The dildo. Yes, that one. Let's just say it plainly. You may think of the dildo as a modern invention rubber, silicone, electric, but the idea of using a shaped object for personal stimulation is far older than plastic and power cords. In fact, the word itself dates back to at least the early modern period, with roots possibly tied to Italian diletto, delight, or even the Old English dildine, a term for thrusting. But the thing itself that existed long before anyone wrote a polite word for it. You find yourself now inside a stone cottage near the woods, candles flickering against the soot-stained walls. The woman who lives here, Idne, is a widow in her 50s, quiet, sharp-eyed, known in her village for being odd but useful. She grows rare herbs, sells eggs, carves spoons, and among her collection of wooden trinkets and polished tools is something not quite shaped like a spoon. It sits in a box beneath her bed, wrapped in wool and smelling faintly of beeswax. She doesn't show it off, but she doesn't hide it either, not when she sees you've come to understand. It's pine, she tells you. Smoothed for years. Wasn't always for this, but things evolve. It's not anatomically precise, no detailing, no flair, but it's shaped for purpose, and it's seen use. She oils it now and then, keeps it wrapped, cleans it carefully. Some say it's sinful, she mutters, but those are usually people who don't know what to do with themselves in the dark. She chuckles, but there's history in her voice long nights, long marriages, longer silences. This doesn't talk back, doesn't take, just gives. You pause because here's the thing. Dildos in the Middle Ages are rarely mentioned in writing and almost never by name. They're hidden in euphemism, metaphor, and implication. But they're there. There are legal records from the 15th century where women are prosecuted for using devices made in the likeness of male members on themselves or others. One such case from France involves two women who lived together, shared a bed, and were accused of impersonating the marital act with false instruments. The object was seized, described in court as wooden, warmed, and indecently shaped. The women were punished, the object burned. So yes, they existed, they were feared, and they were used. Your quirky historical footnote for the night. In a preserved inventory list from a mid-14th century Italian noblewoman's estate, there's a curious entry. Una figura di legno, ben levigata, per usanza privata. Translation: a wooden figure, well smoothed, for personal use. No further details, no justification, just tucked in among the jewelry, the gloves, the books. A quiet admission that pleasure had a place even in the polished world of the elite. But what about ordinary women? Well, here's where we hit the edge of the surviving evidence. We don't have a treasure trove of labeled medieval sex toys. What we do have are stories half remembered, half erased of women like Idne, women who worked with wood or horn or bone, women who carved things under the guise of tools, women who shaped objects for therapeutic use or womb stimulation. The scholarly debate is whether these items were genuinely for pleasure or had purely medicinal purposes. But again, it's about the context. When something is shaped just so, kept hidden just there, and cared for just that way, well, you can draw your own conclusions. Idne runs a cloth across the grain of her tool, checking it for roughness. Can't have splinters, she says deadpan. That's one way to ruin an evening. Then, after a pause, I've made a few for others quietly. A sister-in-law, a lonely seamstress, once for a woman who said she just liked the weight of it in her hands. She looks up, half challenging. They never come back to complain. And here's the heart of it. In a world where female sexuality was either denied or demonized, the dildo was an artifact of defiance. It didn't need permission. It didn't belong to a man. It didn't reproduce or obey or confess. It pleasured silently, steadfastly, in secret. That's probably why they were so feared, not for their shape, but for their autonomy. A woman who could satisfy herself didn't need a husband. A woman who understood her own pleasure might question the rest of the rules. And the church, along with the state, didn't like women who questioned anything. Still, the objects persisted, passed hand to hand, hidden in boxes, buried under floorboards, disguised as cooking tools or medical devices, never named directly because naming would have made them real, and real things are harder to burn. Idne leans back in her chair, the firelight catching her gray braid. You know what's funny? She asks. I've prayed with one hand and pleasured with the other. Never felt like the Lord minded either way. You don't laugh, you just nod. Because by now you understand the layers of that statement, the decades of silence behind it, the certainty earned through touch and time that the divine and the sensual were never enemies, just two sides of a coin that the world refused to flip. You step back out into the woods as the wind picks up, rustling the canopy above. The path feels different now, like you're walking with the knowledge of something that was never supposed to survive, but did not in texts, not in sermons, but in carved pine and calloused hands, in the steady rhythm of women who found pleasure on their own terms and didn't wait for permission to reach it. They didn't need a name for it. They just needed to feel real. You leave the woods with the whisper of pine still clinging to your clothes and step back into the lanes of a small village nestled along the edge of open farmland. This place feels older than old, not because of its age, but because of what it keeps hidden in plain sight. Stone walls draped in moss, thatched roofs sagging with rain, narrow doorways built just wide enough for one. You're here not for a person this time, but an object, or more accurately, a pattern woven across the tapestries that hang in homes, abbeys, and halls. Tonight, you're staring at the threads. Because sometimes history doesn't whisper, it weaves. Inside one low cottage, you meet Joan, a woman who spins flax and dyes wool with walnut husks and onion skins. Her hands are the color of bark, and her back bends slightly from years at the loom. She's quiet, practical, and the kind of person you'd overlook unless you knew what you were looking for. On the far wall of her home hangs a large woven tapestry, a pastoral scene. Nothing scandalous at first glance. There's a shepherdess, a tree, a river, all very pious, very safe until you look closer. One vine wraps around the trunk in a perfect spiral. Its tip curls just so suspiciously suggestive. The shepherdess's fingers are oddly positioned on her spindle, and those sheep a bit too interested in the knotted roots beneath the trees. It doesn't scream erotic. It smirks it. This was a language of its own. During the Middle Ages, embroidery and tapestry weren't just decoration. They were storytelling, documentation, and in some cases, rebellion. And women, especially those confined to the domestic sphere, spent hours stitching long days, aching fingers, minds wandering. Some of those minds stitched prayers, others something far cheekier. Let's talk about the Bayeux Tapestry. Yes, that one, the one that chronicles the Norman conquest. Technically not a tapestry at all, it's embroidery. But that's beside the point. What matters is what hides in its margins, tiny, almost cartoonish scenes, a naked man squatting, a woman lifting her skirts, various appendages appearing where they shouldn't. Scholars have long debated what these images mean. Are they warnings, jokes, winks to the viewer? Maybe all of the above. And then there's the practice of samplers' smaller embroidery pieces made by women to show their skill. Most are filled with biblical verses, floral patterns, or moral sayings. But now and then, one turns up with curious additions. A flower that looks suspiciously like vulva, a bird's beak diving into petals, a pair of hands holding something unidentifiable but somehow unmistakably phallic. These weren't accidental. They were coded messages stitched in secrecy, passed from woman to woman, hanging in bedrooms behind curtains or tucked into dowries as private jokes, or maybe quiet testaments to personal discovery. Your quirky fringe fact for this chapter. In 1992, a sampler dating to the late 15th century was discovered behind a false panel in a Devon manor house. It featured a garden scene, a tower, and a maiden kneeling. Innocent, right? Until scholars looked closer and realized the tower was distinctly phallic, and the maiden's prayer looked a lot more like a masturbation posture than a devotional one. One stitched little rebellion preserved for 500 years. Back in Joan's cottage, she tells you that every woman learns her own stitch eventually. The men don't look twice, she says. They just see a lamb or a vine. But we know. We always know. She points to another tapestry, one she keeps rolled beneath her bed. This one is more direct. It shows a tree with long, drooping fruit. Beneath it, a woman sits with her skirts lifted, face turned skyward, hand between her thighs. The fruit above her is bursting open. The threads are a bit frayed, but the intent is unmistakable. There's truth in thread, Joan says. Keeps your fingers busy and your secret safe. She tells you about a friend long gone now who stitched an entire piece of linen full of barely hidden acts of self-pleasure, hands under skirts, women bathing together, fruit dripping juice, and sewed it into the hem of her wedding sheet. Her husband never noticed, but she knew it was there beneath them every night, a reminder that she still belonged to herself. This raises the scholarly debate, of course. Some historians argue that the erotic interpretations of medieval embroidery are modern projections, that what looks sexual to us might have simply been natural symbolism, fertility references, or even misunderstood plant forms. But others say the repetition, the placement, and the intentional ambiguity are exactly the point. That women used a visual language because they couldn't speak the words. They weren't writing books. They weren't carving wood. They had thread, so they used it. You walk with Joan to the edge of a small orchard just outside the village. On a faded linen cloth, she shows you a newer piece she's been working on. It's just a collection of herbs, mugwort, valerian, yarrow. But if you tilt your head, the curves start to resemble something else, something softer, something secret. She doesn't confirm. She just smiles and says, "The body has its own symbols. Some of us just learn how to stitch them. And that's what this is, a silent archive of women's pleasure, hidden in border designs and floral motifs. Not loud, not lewd, just quiet reminders that even in domestic labor, even in spaces meant to keep them contained, women found ways to express what they couldn't say. They stitched desire into vines. They embroidered longing into petals. They wrapped their private joy in linen, folded it, and placed it carefully into drawers. That's the real rebellion, making something beautiful from something forbidden. As you leave Joan's cottage, the sky is beginning to pale. The horizon blushes with early light, like a body just beginning to stir. And behind you, in a house filled with wool and stories, a tapestry hangs crooked on the wall, just enough to keep the secret safe. The morning light slides slow and golden over the fields as you follow a winding path toward the edge of the manor district, where the houses get larger, the stone walls higher, and the fabrics hanging from windows just a bit too fine to be practical. It's a place of hierarchy, where even the breeze feels filtered. But you're not here for lace and titles. You're here for what's hidden beneath all of it. Because sometimes the most forbidden pleasures weren't behind monastery walls or buried under straw. They were stitched into sleeves, brushed across skin, woven into the very cloth a woman wore. Welcome to the world of sensual fabric. You step into the private chamber of Lady Cecily, a noblewoman of 38, whose husband is off negotiating something political and whose children are with the wet nurse. The room smells like beeswax polish, crushed lavender, and the faint dizzying sweetness of imported spices. The tapestries here aren't suggestive, at least not like Joan's. They're grand, full of saints and allegories. But what catches your eye isn't the wall. It's the bed, or more specifically, the silk laid over it. Cecily watches you look. She knows. The silk is deep red and impossibly soft, expensive, rare, the kind of fabric that takes months to make and could buy a small cottage if sold on the right day. She tells you she requested it specially. For warmth, she says, though there's not a chill in the air. Then she picks up a second piece, black velvet edged in silver thread. This one, she says slowly, pressing it to her cheek, feels like breath. She's not being poetic, she's being honest. In the medieval world, fabric wasn't just fashion, it was sensation. And for women, especially those of means, certain fabrics became conduits for pleasure. Sumptuary laws restricted who could wear what, often forbidding commoners from using velvet, silk, or fur. Why? Because those fabrics mattered. They clung to the body, they moved against the skin, they aroused. There are records of women, particularly noble women, lining their undergarments with fur not for warmth, but for intimate contact. The soft brush of rabbit or squirrel fur on inner thighs, not an accident, not when you could afford linen and wool for warmth. This was intentional, hidden, unspoken, but very much felt. Cecily lifts the hem of her chemise to show a patch of cloth sewn near the hip white silk, thin as breath. Sometimes, she confesses, when the days are long and I'm alone, I sit still and let it move across me. She doesn't finish the sentence. She doesn't have to. Your quirky fact of the evening, in a 15th century French inventory of a noble woman's belongings, there's mention of a lining of velvet sewn discreetly into the bed linen for nocturnal rest. Now, we could pretend that's about comfort, but velvet is hot, heavy, and suffocating if used purely for sleeping, unless you weren't planning on sleeping, unless your bed linen was doing more than keeping you warm. So, what do the scholars say? Some dismiss these accounts as misinterpretations, practical luxury, not sensual subversion. But others point to the frequency of these choices: velvet inner linings, fur-trimmed shifts, silk that barely covered anything at all. They argue that women were using fabric not just to dress themselves, but to feel themselves. And in a world where pleasure couldn't be spoken, touch became the language of resistance. Cecily tells you about her favorite robe dyed indigo, lined with otter fur, weighted just enough to press against her body as she walks. "If I move slowly," she says, "it wraps me like a hand." She laughs low in her throat. "Sometimes I don't even have to do anything else." And here's where the conversation gets even more interesting. In private letters, especially those between women, there are mentions of the blush-colored lining or that sleeve that feels like breath. These weren't just aesthetic comments. They were code, a language of texture, temperature, and subtlety that allowed women to discuss pleasure without ever using the word. One noblewoman writes to her sister in a letter preserved in a 14th century collection, "The new velvet chemise you sent me is distracting. I thank you. I wear it often when I'm meant to pray. That's not about fashion. That's about feeling." You sit on Cecily's bed as she runs her fingers down a bolt of silk. She tells you she used to think pleasure had to come from someone else, her husband, a lover, a poem. But one afternoon, while trying on a new garment, she felt a shiver from the fabric alone. "It slid across me," she says, "and I realized I don't need anyone to touch me. I can feel this and remember I'm alive. And this opens the door to an entire world of private rituals." Women wore certain fabrics on certain days. Some lined their undergarments with rose petals soaked in honey water. Some chilled their linens before pressing them to warm thighs. Some, like Cecily, simply wrapped themselves in silk and let the texture do what years of silence and marriage had not awakened them. But the debate endures. Did these women know what they were doing, or were they just enjoying comfort, blissfully unaware of the erotic undercurrent? Maybe both. Maybe they didn't have the language to explain it, but their bodies understood. And sometimes the body leads where words won't follow. You stand now, letting your hand brush across Cecily's silk bedspread. It's soft, yes, but it's also heavy, grounding like it remembers every hand that's touched it and every thought that's lingered beneath it. She watches you closely, then says, "Take some, just a piece. Keep it near your skin, you'll see." And you believe her, because fabric, like memory, can hold more than what it seems. It can be both shield and key. It can wrap a woman in softness when the world only offers hardness. It can bring in silence, in slowness, in secret. As you leave her chamber, you feel the smooth silk tucked inside your sleeve, pressed against your wrist like a promise. And you realize that even in the most proper places, where everything looks controlled and holy and clean, desire lives. Sometimes not in moans or motion, but in the brush of cloth against bare skin. And the woman who wears that cloth, she knows. You leave the manor district behind, the memory of silk lingering on your skin like a ghost. It follows you through the shifting light of day, down a hill toward a smaller settlement where the air smells like barley mash and tanned leather. This place is less polished, more practical. Homes are tighter together, livestock wanders freely, and voices carry easily across the square. But you're not here for the noise. You're here for the silence, the ones preserved in ink, in careful script and well-meaning diagnoses between the lines of men who thought they understood the female body, but really didn't. Today, you're cracking open the medical texts. You step into the stone-walled house of a barber surgeon named Arnold, where scrolls and codices lie open across a splintering desk. He's a local physician of sorts, not university-trained, but well-read, respected, and just detached enough to write about women without actually speaking to many of them. He offers you a chair beside his cluttered writing bench and gestures to the open manuscript. De secretis mulierum, he says, on the secrets of women. Quite useful. Yes, that one originally attributed to a medieval scholar named Albertus Magnus, though most experts now believe it wasn't written by him at all. De secretis mulierum was a wildly popular text throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. It promised to explain the mysteries of the female body menstruation, conception, pregnancy, and yes, sexuality. But what it mostly did was get things hilariously, outrageously wrong. According to the text, women's bodies were cold, wet, and inferior to men's, because of course they were. It explains that a woman's desire originates in the womb, which is prone to wandering if left unsatisfied. Yes, the infamous wandering womb theory. Masturbation then wasn't just sinful, it was dangerous. It might excite the womb, which could then float upward and cause suffocation, madness, or death. You blink. Arnold shrugs. That's why we prescribe marriage or leeches. Of course, it's easy to laugh until you realize how deeply this kind of misinformation shaped women's lives. These medical beliefs weren't fringe, they were mainstream. They informed how priests treated confessing women, how midwives were instructed to manage hysterical episodes, how husbands were told to pacify their wives if they showed signs of discontent, often through sex but not necessarily through affection. Here's your quirky historical fact. A 14th century Italian physician named Taddeo Alderotti described a treatment for women suffering from melancholia of the womb that involved stimulating the genitals with warm compresses, herbs, and gentle friction, ideally performed by a trusted female assistant. Sounds like a spa day or a very old-school vibrator session. But of course, it was never described as pleasure. It was treatment. And therein lies the twist. Medical texts often framed masturbation, especially female masturbation, as both a disease and a cure. It was wrong if a woman did it on her own, uncontrolled, hidden. But if it was prescribed, if it came with the right herbs, the right gloves, under the guise of restoring balance, suddenly, it was medicine. That's the scholarly debate in a nutshell. Were these male-authored remedies actually unspoken acknowledgments of female sexuality? Or were they oblivious attempts to medicalize things they didn't understand? You lean over Arnold's shoulder and read a case study he's copied. A woman in her 20s, no name, given complains of tightness in the belly, restlessness, heat between her thighs. She's advised to release the humors through a sequence of hot poultices, oil massages, and pressure applied to the gate of pleasure. It's written clinically, coldly, but it's impossible to ignore what's really happening here. Someone prescribed her a guided orgasm with all the bedside manner of a tax accountant, and not all treatments were hands-on, some were herbal. Arnold hands you a satchel of dried damiana leaves, rosemary, and crushed fennel. This is for womb stirrings, he explains. Calms the blood, encourages movement. You imagine how many women drank such teas with a knowing smile. They didn't need to read Latin to feel what was happening. They just needed to know their own bodies. But not every woman welcomed these remedies. For many, the shame ran deep. Centuries of sermons and scoldings had taught them that any desire was a deviation. So when the treatments worked, when the pressure and heat and friction brought them relief, they panicked, they confessed, they fasted, and some of them were punished for experiencing the very pleasure that their doctors had prescribed. This is where Arnold looks most uncomfortable. He's not cruel, just clueless. Like most physicians of the time, he knows how to describe symptoms but not sensations. It's not about pleasure, he insists. It's about restoring balance. He doesn't realize that for a woman who has spent her life being told her body is sinful, balance can feel a lot like joy, and that joy can feel like sin. You glance around his workspace, diagrams of the female reproductive system drawn with more imagination than accuracy, a jar labeled womb salts, a bronze tool shaped oddly. Arnold calls it a dilator, but the smooth, rounded end and the polished handle tell you otherwise. Whatever its official purpose, you suspect its use far beyond diagnosis. And that's the part that matters most. These medical objects and rituals, the oils, the massages, the steam baths, and friction tools, weren't just clinical. They were contact. They allowed women many for the first time to interact with their bodies in ways that felt good. Maybe they didn't call it masturbation. Maybe they didn't even realize it. But their bodies did. Their bodies knew. You leave Arnold's house with a crumpled page from his manuscript in hand. The words faded, but legible. The woman is calmed by release, and her humors return to peace. There's no mention of sin, no punishment, just a quiet acknowledgement that relief matters, that pleasure heals. And maybe somewhere in the next town over, a woman will take her own copy of that text, light a candle, warm a compress, and run her hands exactly where she's been told to, not because she wants to be wicked, but because she wants to be whole. And maybe, just maybe, she'll feel something that goes far beyond balance, something like bliss. By the time you leave Arnold's house, the sun is high, and the world feels too bright for everything you now carry with you. Velvet secrets, pine wood tools, steam bath ecstasies disguised as medical care. And yet the day keeps turning. You follow a road that stretches beyond the town's edge, winding through groves of apple trees and fields of wheat until you come to a walled garden, half overgrown, half cultivated. A strange blend of wildness and precision. Vines twist through trellises, flowers bloom in tight clusters and then sprawl recklessly. Bees hum, a fountain trickles quietly in the center. This is no ordinary garden. This is the garden of earthly delights, or rather, a version of it. You're not looking at Bosch's chaotic masterpiece, though you'll think of it later. This is the medieval hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden, a symbolic space packed with theological metaphor, courtly romance, and if you look close enough, more than a little sensual suggestion. You step through the low gate, and at once you're wrapped in scent, damask roses, sage, mint, violets. The air is thick with life, but it's also quiet. This garden isn't meant for gathering crops or tending livestock. It's meant for something else entirely. Meditation, yes, solitude, but also fantasy. In medieval art and literature, gardens like this were often depicted as the setting for sacred encounters. The Virgin Mary receives the angel in a walled garden. Lovers in romances meet amid the roses. Even allegorical figures like Lady Reason or Dame Nature conduct their conversations beneath fig trees. But between all that holiness and high-minded dialogue, something else is blooming. Desire. You sit near a hedge where a statue of a woman stone-faced and serene holds a blooming pomegranate. Her gown clings in all the wrong places. Her expression is not modest, and behind her, a low stone bench is worn exactly in the spot where thighs would rest. Someone's been here before. This space, like many medieval gardens, is layered with metaphor. The pomegranate for fertility, the rose for virginity, the fountain you already know. These gardens were designed to reflect virtue, but they couldn't help hinting at pleasure enclosed, hidden, controlled, but not inert. Your quirky fact of the day. In some medieval manuscripts, especially those written by courtly women, garden scenes are used as coded diaries. One 14th century noblewoman in Burgundy wrote a poem titled The Garden Within, where she describes laying among lilies and plucking ripe figs in secret. Sounds innocent until the line, "The dew gathered where I touched, and I drank until the silence sang." Literary scholars have tried to call it spiritual. Others say it's clearly erotic. Maybe it's both. And that's the thing. These gardens weren't just symbols of purity. They were paradoxes. They offered containment and freedom. You could walk here alone, away from the house, away from the eyes. You could breathe deeply, touch the petals, let your hand trail into the fountain just a little too long, and no one would question it. You walk through the rows of herbs, pausing at a patch of fennel and rue plants historically associated with fertility, arousal, and feminine balance. Women would gather here not just for cooking herbs, but for whispers, remedies, maybe instructions. One woman says, "Place the leaves under your tongue before you dream." Another says, "Let the mint oil warm your palms before you touch a ritual, a rhythm." In one corner of the garden sits a woven bench shaded by a climbing vine. You sit and close your eyes, letting the scent and breeze wrap around you. You can almost hear them, centuries of women passing through this space. Some praying, some plotting, some simply lying back on the cool grass, slipping fingers beneath layers of cloth, surrounded by bees and birdsong, finding themselves in a space where no one was asking questions and no one was watching. There's a documented example of this exact kind of garden used by nuns in southern France. Though technically a spiritual retreat, its layout included secluded alcoves of stone benches nestled behind hedges, and even a small bathing pool that could be heated with coals. One surviving journal from a visiting noblewoman, intended as a devotional reflection, includes a curious line. "I washed and waited, and the water taught me things I did not confess." That line has puzzled historians for years. But you get it. The garden didn't just offer women beauty. It gave them space, the kind of physical and emotional room required for self-exploration. A place where arousal could stretch out without being punished, where a woman could lie beneath the apple tree and think of saints or a crush or her own hands and never have to explain. There's ongoing scholarly debate around the role of these gardens. Were they really places of secret pleasure, or are we projecting too much meaning into vines and fountains? Traditionalists say they were spiritual metaphors. Others argue the repeated presence of sensual imagery can't be ignored. The garden becomes a liminal space, not quite sacred, not quite profane, which is precisely why it works. Because in a world that offered no bedroom privacy, no sexual education, and certainly no affirmation of female desire, gardens became more than just symbols. They became hiding places for heat. You walk back to the center of the garden, near the trickling fountain. You dip your fingers into the water cool and soft, and remember that for centuries this same gesture might have stirred something, a memory, a longing, a touch. Maybe a young girl would come here after her chores, sit with her skirts pulled slightly up, let her fingers explore what no one had named. Maybe she felt fear. Or maybe, just maybe, she felt like this garden contained but lush, shaped by walls but growing wildly in her own way. As you leave through the wooden gate, your fingers still damp, you glance back once. A breeze rustles the roses. The pomegranate statue seems to smile. And somewhere behind that hedge, a woman waits, not for rescue, not for a lover, but for the next moment she can be alone in her own body, beneath sun and leaf, touching the root of herself without shame. You leave the garden just as the sun dips low behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the worn path ahead. The air smells of turned earth and ripening apples, the day softening into that familiar hush just before evening when everything starts to exhale. You walk now with purpose toward a story older than silk, older than saints, older even than the garden's tangled symbols. A story with teeth one that shaped every whispered warning, every stitched secret, every burning blush behind shuttered windows. You're headed straight into the heart of the first and perhaps most enduring narrative of shame, the tale of Eve. She's everywhere in the medieval world, on cathedral walls, in stained glass windows, painted into manuscripts, sculpted into stone archways. Always with that apple, always naked but hiding, often scolded, rarely defended. In the minds of medieval clergy and lay people alike, Eve wasn't just the mother of humanity. She was the mother of sin. And her greatest crime, wanting, reaching, tasting, knowing. You step inside a chapel now small and forgotten, tucked behind a crumbling stable. The roof leaks and half the candles are stubs. But on the far wall, illuminated by the last streak of sunlight, is a faded fresco of Eve in the garden. She's beautiful, round, wild arms curled around her body, but her face is twisted in something that isn't quite guilt. It's more complicated, like she's sorry, but not entirely. Like maybe somewhere under the punishment, she remembers the thrill of biting into that fruit and realizing she felt something. And that's what you're here to unpack. In medieval theology, Eve's desire wasn't just a plot point, it was a framework. It shaped the entire way the church talked about female sexuality. Augustine, the go-to voice for post-Roman Christian morality, argued that Eve's temptation brought lust into the world, that before the fall, humans could engage in sex without shame, without desire, purely as a function. But after, suddenly bodies were unpredictable. Sin lived in the flesh, especially in women's flesh, which meant that from that moment on, every flicker of female pleasure was a kind of echo, a return to that first bite, that first touch, that original yes. But let's talk about the weird, lesser-known detail in all this, the fringe fact buried beneath centuries of sermons. Some medieval thinkers genuinely believed that Eve's sin wasn't just disobedience, it was masturbation. No, really. In a few obscure theological commentaries, rare but real, there's an interpretation that Eve's curiosity wasn't limited to the apple, that when she gained knowledge, she turned it inward, that she touched herself, and that this act opened the door to lust, to sin, to shame. Now, this wasn't mainstream doctrine. It's not something you'll find in official catechisms. But the idea slipped in through confessionals, local sermons, whispered teachings. The idea that the first woman wanted too much, knew too much, touched too deeply, and the result, generations of women told to distrust their own fingertips. You sit in the back pew now, looking up at that fresco again. Eve's hand hovers just above the apple. But now you wonder if the artist meant something more. If that pose, that hesitation wasn't just about a piece of fruit, but about the moment before you reach down and break a rule you were never meant to survive. And yet, women didn't stop reaching. They may have been taught that desire was a wound, but they still pressed into it. And for many, Eve wasn't just a warning. She was a mirror, the first woman to act on hunger, the first to seek knowledge, the first to be punished for curiosity, not violence. There's a medieval poem little known, tucked in the margins of a devotional manuscript from the 13th century. The author is anonymous, but the voice is clear. A woman writes, "I would have bitten it too had I been there, not from hunger, but from wanting to feel the juice and taste what the world had hidden." She ends the poem not with repentance, but with defiance. "Let God guard the gates. I walk in with my mouth open. Tell me that's not powerful." Of course, the scholars go back and forth. Some argue that medieval women fully internalized Eve's shame, that they feared their bodies and sought only to purify them. Others argue that even within that system, women found ways to reclaim her story, that Eve became not just a villain, but an origin point, a reminder that the body matters, that touch isn't always sin, that knowing yourself, really knowing, is both dangerous and divine. You leave the chapel now, but Eve stays with you, not the weeping Eve of penitential art, not the blame-ridden figure of Sunday sermons, but a different Eve, one with dirt under her nails and a smirk on her lips, a woman who looked at the most forbidden thing in the world and said, "Why not?" And maybe that's the question medieval women kept asking. Why not feel this? Why not touch myself when no one's looking? Why not let pleasure unfold in the quiet when everything else has been taken from me? They lived with the consequences, of course. Confession, punishment, guilt. But beneath all of that, a spark, a legacy, a lineage of women who took the story of the first sinner and rewrote it, not in ink, but in sensation. And perhaps tonight, in a stone-walled room, another woman will lie awake and think of Eve not with scorn, but with recognition. She'll place one hand between her thighs and whisper, "A thank you not to God, not to the devil, but to the woman who reached first." Because sometimes the fruit isn't forbidden. It's ripe, and it's waiting. The road twists now, narrowing into a dusty track lined with stones and wildflowers as you move farther from towns and closer to the kinds of places that don't show up on maps. The air feels dry, a little thinner, and there's a weight in your chest that isn't quite dread, but something close to curiosity laced with unease. You're headed into the strange territory of medieval medicine, where female pleasure was rarely acknowledged directly, but often blamed when things went wrong. Tonight, you're unwrapping one of the most misunderstood and honestly most ridiculous medical theories of the time, the idea of the wandering womb. Yes, you read that right, the wandering womb. According to several medieval physicians and before them, ancient Greek and Roman thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen, a woman's uterus could become unmoored and start floating around her body. This was considered the cause of everything from fainting to hysteria to seizures to choking fits and even death. A restless womb, they claimed, was a dangerous thing. Now, imagine living with that over your head every day. Not only were women taught that their bodies were inherently flawed, but that a literal organ could go rogue at any time if not properly managed. You step into the home of a healer named Sabina. She's not a university-trained doctor. She's a folk practitioner, somewhere between midwife and wise woman. And her house smells like warm milk, resin, and roasted roots. She greets you with a nod and sets a pot to boil, tossing in dried herbs with such ease it feels like muscle memory. "You'll hear about the womb," she says without looking up. "Aren't we all?" Sabina has spent her life dealing with the symptoms male doctors wrote about but never experienced: cramps, heat, night sweats, dreams that left women flushed and shaken. The womb doesn't wander, she says plainly, but it does speak. And women, she tells you, have always known how to listen, even when no one else did. She pulls out a cloth-wrapped bundle from under the table. Inside, a clay jar filled with scented oil, a stone smoothed by decades of use, and a small handheld fan made from woven reeds. This, she says, is how we bring the womb back. The ritual involves warmth, pressure, breath, and here's the part no one likes to say out loud, a very specific kind of stimulation. According to Sabina, a womb that feels neglected stirs the rest of the body into chaos. Not unlike the rest of us, she adds with a half-smile. Her treatments include oil massages, slow circular movements over the abdomen and thighs, along with warm compresses and sometimes guided release. "We don't name it," she says. "We just let it happen." And here's the strange, brilliant part. It works, not because of magic or mysticism, but because Sabina is giving these women something the formal medical establishment refused to: permission to feel, to explore, to finish. Let's go deeper into the scholarly side. Medieval medicine was based on the theory of humors, 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, that needed to stay in balance. Women were thought to be cold and wet by nature, overly governed by blood. When this blood, a polite way of saying sexual energy, built up, it needed to be released or else it could rot, stagnate, or send the womb wandering in search of heat. That's where things get unintentionally funny. One medical text from the 13th century describes the womb as a greedy animal, always hungry for moisture and warmth, curling upward through the chest if denied them. The prescribed cure: sweet-smelling herbs placed near the nose and foul-smelling herbs between the legs to lure the womb back into place like it's a confused cat. But Sabina isn't working with confused cats. She's working with desperate women. She tells you about a widow who came to her after months of sleeplessness and crushing melancholy. Doctors blamed her age. Her priest blamed Eve. But Sabina, she touched her belly, felt the tension, and knew. She hadn't touched herself in years. She, Sabina explains, didn't even remember how. So Sabina guided her slowly, gently with warm oil and steady pressure, not as a lover, but as a healer. By the time she left, Sabina says, she cried not from shame, from remembering she was still in there. That's what gets lost in all the medical nonsense, the core truth that a woman's pleasure is not a luxury or a sin, but a form of return, a reclamation. Now, not all scholars agree on this interpretation. Some argue that treatments like Sabina's were rooted in superstition, not pleasure, that they were never meant to encourage masturbation, but to prevent it, redirecting the desire towards something clinical. But others say the line is thin. When the treatment includes oil, privacy, and guided touch, it's hard to pretend the outcome isn't sensual, especially when the women return not just healed, but glowing. Sabina leans over and lights a small brazier filled with mint and mugwort. The scent fills the room sharp and heady. Most of what we treat, she says, is longing. We just call it by other names. She shows you a wooden tool narrow, curved, worn smooth. To press the womb, she claims, but you know, so does she. And that's the secret at the heart of this whole wandering womb theory, that it was never about the uterus moving around like a confused ghost. It was about explaining away what couldn't be controlled female arousal, female pleasure, female autonomy. And instead of embracing it, they turned it into an illness. But women like Sabina turned it right back. You watch her pack up her tools, wipe the oil from her hands, and prepare her room for the next visitor. Another woman will come soon, with tightness in her belly and shame in her voice, and Sabina will teach her too, not how to pray it away or fear it or bury it, but how to listen, to soothe, to press the heat instead of hiding it. As you step back into the fading light, the air is warm against your face. The earth beneath your feet feels steadier somehow, and you realize again what medieval women must have felt in their most private moments, that despite the sermons, the medicine, the myths, they knew what their bodies needed. Not gods, not scholars, not husbands, just them. Just a little heat, a little time, and the freedom to follow wherever the womb, real or metaphorical, wanted to go. The light is changing again, blue now, edged with the softest silver as twilight begins its quiet descent. You've left the wild herbs and wandering wombs behind, but tonight's destination takes you somewhere even more intimate. You're returning to the chapel, but not the kind where saints stare down from stained glass or sermons echo off marble walls. No, this place is hidden beneath the floorboards, behind a cracked stone arch where cool air lingers and forgotten things sleep. You're entering a space untouched for centuries, and inside it, a drawer, not a metaphorical drawer, a real one wooden shallow, built into the frame of an old prayer kneeler, once used by the nuns of an abbey that was abandoned in the late 1400s and eventually buried by time and moss. The kneeler was uncovered during renovations just decades ago, half-rotted, full of dust. Most thought it was empty, but beneath the warped baseboard was a narrow compartment, and what it held rewrites the story. Inside were two small carved objects, both phallic in shape, smoothed by hand, wrapped in linen. Alongside them, a short journal, its pages fragile but mostly intact. The script clear, elegant, written by a woman who identified herself only as S.A. Nun, a sister, a woman of God, and something else. You're reading her journal now, seated on the old stone steps with the faint scent of damp earth and incense curling through the air. S doesn't name her abbey, she doesn't name her confessor, but she names desire over and over like a prayer. I have lived 2 lives, she writes, the one they see and the one that wakes me in the dark. She speaks of dreams so vivid she wakes soaked with sweat, of kneeling in prayer and feeling heat curl low in her belly, of evenings spent alone in the scriptorium where the sound of her own breath became louder than any psalm. And eventually she writes of carving. I began with the wood from a broken stool, small, rounded, polished, until it sang against my hand. She used beeswax to seal it and linen to keep it hidden. She named it her second voice. She doesn't say the word masturbation. That word didn't exist in the way we use it now. But she says this: I touched not for sin but for silence, for remembering that I am more than a soul in a habit. It's a strange kind of relic, this drawer of carved secrets, not holy, not profane, just human. Now, the Church has long tried to erase this kind of story. Even now the objects aren't on display. They are stored quietly in a museum archive, labeled as personal devotional items which, depending on your imagination, isn't entirely wrong. Scholars debate their use. Some insist they were fertility charms. Others suggest therapeutic massage tools. But if you read S's words, if you hold the linen-wrapped wood in your hands, if you listen, you know. You know this wasn't a tool for health, it was a tether to herself. S writes that she wasn't the only one. We did not speak of it, she notes, but there were eyes that met mine in the candlelight with knowing. She describes a sister who hummed softly during evening prayers, her body swaying more than necessary. Another who asked too many questions about herbs that heat the blood. These were not accidents. They were signals glances passed beneath veils, a shared understanding that what the Church couldn't name, women would still find. Your fringe fact tonight: in the early 15th century, a bishop's report from a monastery in what's now northern Spain accused several nuns of suspicious behavior at night and confiscated a set of instruments not befitting chastity. The items were never described in detail, but the language used, carved in the likeness of the masculine and softened with oils, left little to the imagination. The report was buried, redacted, forgotten, but the truth poked through. Because, of course, women touch themselves, even in the heart of sacred spaces, especially there. Where else were they free from men, from marriage, from the noise? This drawer, S's drawer, is more than a stash spot. It's a time capsule proof that for at least one woman, the act of self-pleasure wasn't rebellion. It was ritual, something done with care, with rhythm, with gratitude, something woven into her daily life right alongside rosary beads and candle wicks. She describes the moment after lying flat, palms open, whispering psalms not out of shame, but peace. I do not think God is angered, she writes. I think he listens. I think he understands the music I make with my breath. That's where the scholarly debate rages hardest. Some insist that nuns like S were anomalies, that their actions were deviations, not reflections of any broader experience. But others argue that these moments, though rarely recorded, must have been more common than we assume. After all, what kind of system forces young women into vows of chastity, locks them in cells, encourages them to purge every impure thought, and then pretends their bodies simply comply? The drawer says otherwise. You close the journal slowly, fingers lingering on the brittle edge of the parchment. You trace the grain of the wooden object wrapped beside it, and you feel somehow not like a voyeur, but a witness like someone who's just been entrusted with a secret too precious to keep buried. You step back into the chapel's main room. Above you, the crucifix looms, but it doesn't feel angry, just watchful, maybe even tender, because maybe, just maybe, holiness isn't the opposite of pleasure. Maybe it's what happens when the two meet in quiet defiance. You walk out into the night air, stars just starting to press through the dark. And somewhere beneath layers of stone and moss and dust, that drawer remains still hidden, still real, still holding the truth that women, even in their most sacred roles, still reached for themselves, not in sin, not in secrecy, but in the quiet, pulsing act of remembering they were whole. You leave the chapel ruins behind with the air crisp on your skin and something like reverence trailing behind your steps. The moon has crested the tree line now, laying a thin silver gloss over everything it touches, the rooftops, the stone fences, the still warm road. You walk for a while, farther out this time, past the abbeys and markets and manor walls, until the paths lose their edges and fields stretch wide into the dark. There's a cottage here, hunched low beneath the sky, half swallowed by the tall grass. No spires, no shrines, just a thatched roof, a sagging door, and a curl of smoke threading into the night. Welcome to the world of the medieval peasant woman. This is where most women lived, not in noble halls or sacred cloisters, not surrounded by saints or scandal, just here, in small homes with chickens outside and children inside, with aching backs and rough hands and a rhythm of life so constant that pleasure often got left in the margins, unless, of course, you made space for it. You knock, and the woman who answers the door is named Ada. She's not young, not old, just real. There's dirt on her skirt, flour on her arms, and a calm in her eyes that comes from surviving more than one hard season. She offers you bread before words, then pulls up a stool by the hearth and begins to talk as if you've always been here. You want to know how we handle the ache? She says simply, hands folded, eyes on the fire. Well, it depends on the day. That ache? She means the one that builds quietly over time, not lust the way poets write about it, not sin or scandal or spectacle, just the slow, steady hum that starts when your body remembers itself after hours bent over a washboard or hauling water or stretching wool across the frame. And for women like Ada, that hum had to be answered with what was available: time, privacy, and practicality. Ada's house has no hidden drawer, no silver bed linens, no moonstone tools. What she has is a bench worn smooth where she kneels to grind grain, a rounded stone she keeps near the hearth for warming, useful for muscle aches and other kinds, a small strip of cloth she wraps around her thighs, not for modesty, but for pressure. And her hands, always her hands. I didn't know what I was doing the first time, she admits. It just happened. I was bathing, and the water moved. I moved, and there it was, the quiet. She smiles at the memory, not embarrassed, just thoughtful. After that turning, I learned how to find it again, sometimes with the stone, sometimes in the barn, wherever no one's watching. Here's your quirky footnote for the night. In a 14th century German folk remedy book, tucked between recipes for cough syrup and poultices for bruises, is a short line about the warming of womanly blood through circular massage and breath. No source cited, no explanation given, just a note to let the touch be rhythmic and steady until release of the red vapors. That's not treating a fever. That's describing something else entirely. The scholarly debate, of course, argues over whether medieval peasant women had the time or even the knowledge to engage in self-pleasure. One side says they were too burdened, too uneducated, too monitored. The other side points out that where there are bodies, there is instinct, that even without books or sanctuaries, women knew how to seek relief. That pleasure isn't a luxury. It's a language the body speaks, whether or not you're taught the words. You sit by the hearth with Edda as she tends to her pot of herbs, stirring clockwise, then counter. She tells you about her friend Lena, who never married and lived in the woods with 2 goats and a love of mushrooms. Lena once gave her a handful of dried roots and told her to grind them into oil for the kind of pain only quiet hands can reach. Ada used it sparingly, mostly on her lower belly during moon sickness, but once she used it with her own fingers, slowly under the stars. It was, she says, like coming home to myself. And this is what matters most, the idea of ownership, of knowing your own body well enough to find its edges in the dark. For peasant women, whose days were ruled by weather and work, that act wasn't just about pleasure. It was about returning to something internal, unspoken, entirely theirs. There's an old hearth saying she recites while adding wood to the fire. Better the flame you stoke yourself than the one that burns you uninvited. It's meant as a warning against unwanted touch, but Ida claims it with a knowing glance. She's never said the word masturbation, but she doesn't need to. Her language is older than that. Her pleasure doesn't ask for naming. Before you leave, she presses a bit of smooth beeswax into your palm. Try warming it with your breath before you use it, she says, eyes twinkling. The heat helps. No further instruction. She assumes you'll understand, and you do. You step back outside beneath a quilt of stars, and somewhere behind you, Ada settles into her bed, tucking herself under layers of wool and thyme. Maybe before sleep takes her, she'll reach for that familiar cloth or stone, not with guilt, not with desperation, just with the calm of someone who knows how to quiet her own ache. Because even without saints or silk or scholarly scrolls, women like Ada found ways to feel good. In the barn, in the bath, in the flicker of firelight, when the night finally belonged to no one but them. And that, perhaps, is the clearest truth yet. No matter how rough the world, the body still remembers softness, and the hands they follow. The night deepens as you walk on, the stars sharpening overhead, the road narrowing into a quiet loneliness. There's a hush to this stretch of land, a kind of ancient quiet that presses at your back like a hand. It's the hour when the world feels suspended, when people sleep, and the things they dare not say during daylight finally slip out in dreams. But you're not dreaming. You're moving toward a space where speech was both forbidden and preserved, where women's thoughts, especially the intimate trembling ones, were carved into wax, inked onto parchment, and buried beneath layers of metaphor. Tonight, you're walking into the scriptorium. You arrive at a small priory long deserted, its windows shattered by storms no one remembers, its library strangely intact. The heavy oak door groans open, and the scent of dust, old leather, and ink-stained time fills your lungs. A beam of moonlight cuts through the ruin's roof and falls onto a writing desk. And there, half forgotten, curled like a sleeping animal, is a manuscript. You crack it open, and what's inside doesn't read like a sermon or medical treatise. It reads like longing. We need to talk about medieval women's poetry, and not the kind you find in official collections, polished and passed through male scribes. This is different. This is the fragmented verse found in the margins of prayer books, in personal journals, even in court record snippets that pulse with something electric, something felt. One passage, scrolled in a hand that's careful but unsure, reads, "In the night, I made the sign of the cross and let my hand wander further. I told myself it was for peace, but I found more." There's no name, no title, just that line, tucked in the back of a book of Psalms, right between a passage on suffering and one on divine mercy. That's the kind of subversion women practiced in script. When they couldn't say "I touched myself," they wrote "I wandered." When they couldn't write "I craved," they wrote "My body was restless." And when they couldn't say "I finished," they said "The silence broke and left me whole." Sitting now on the bench beneath that broken roof, you read a poem copied in Latin, but likely written by a woman whose identity has been lost to time. The translation runs something like this: "She brought the oil with her breath and warmed by thought alone, and there in her quiet bed her fingers sang louder than any priest. It's not crass, it's not explicit, it's intimate. And that's the magic of these texts. They remind us that for all the noise the medieval world made about sin, some women wrote their desire into permanence, not loudly, but stubbornly, line by line, hidden in metaphors, wrapped in religious language, but unmistakable if you knew how to read it. Here's your fringe fact for the night. In a 14th century convent, a nun's notebook was discovered containing Latin prayers with unusual phrasing repetitions of words like thirst, quivering, and climbing. A historian argued that it was devotional language. Another scholar pushed back, suggesting it was quasi-erotic mysticism. And then someone else, quietly in a footnote, wondered if it might not be mysticism at all. Just a woman recording what her body did when she touched herself and called it prayer because that was the only word allowed. That's the ongoing debate. Were these women mystics, or were they just deeply, beautifully alone? Some historians argue that sexual ecstasy and religious ecstasy were often indistinguishable in the language of the time. Others argue the overlap was intentional because it was the only safe place for women to express desire. When you couldn't write "I want," you wrote "I long for God." When you couldn't say "I came," you said "I felt lifted." But behind the veil of theology, the reality often pulses through. Women wrote about heat, about breath, about shivers and wetness and aching and peace. They just used symbols, lamps going out and being reignited, the sweet oil of the bridegroom, the wound that closes when touched with love. You find a fragment here that nearly takes your breath. He did not come, but I did. I did. Alone with linen and the psalter open beside me, I sang the song of songs and answered it with my skin. Imagine being her quill in hand, the candle burning low, heart pounding with the risk of writing it down, knowing someone might read it, knowing no one might, but still needing to say it. And here's the strange, lovely irony. Many of these women were writing in Latin, a language reserved for scholars and priests, men who'd never speak of their own bodies, let alone women's. But these women, they bent Latin to their will. They turned it into a language of touch, of pulse, of midnight solitude and post-release quiet. You run your fingers across one such page now, its corners browned with age, its ink faded to ghost script. The words are barely visible, but their meaning hums beneath the surface. A woman wrote this, not for glory, not for fame, but because after touching herself, she needed to speak it somehow. And if no one would hear her voice, maybe the parchment would, and maybe that was enough. Outside, the moon has shifted, pouring its light directly onto the page. You sit in silence, the air so still you can hear the ink's memory breathing. And you realize these aren't just poems. They're testimonies, proof that even in a world where desire was punished, women still dared to record their pleasure, carefully, secretly, but permanently. And that's the softest rebellion of all. The moon has begun its slow descent, dragging the stars with it, and the horizon glows with that faint bruised color just before dawn. But you're not finished. There's one last place to go tonight, a space that exists outside of borders, outside of church bells and manor walls and dusty scrolls. You're headed toward the edge of the forest again, though this time deeper than before. Past the tidy herbs, past the carved spoons, past even the gardens of metaphor and embroidered innuendo. This is where stories lose their polish, where myth and medicine mix freely. This is the world of the cunning woman. She has a dozen names depending on where you find her. Wise woman, herb wife, witch, midwife, bone knitter, moon teller, but they all mean the same thing, a woman who knows things she wasn't supposed to know. She's not just healing wounds or delivering babies, she's guiding people through the murky territory of need, and yes, that includes desire. You find her cottage tucked beneath a leaning willow-its roof patched with bark, the doorway barely wide enough for 2 shoulders. She doesn't open the door when you knock. You walk in, and she's already there, stirring something thick and red in a clay pot, humming under her breath in a language that doesn't care whether it's remembered. She looks up and grins, all teeth and crow's feet. Took you long enough. You sit beside the fire without being told, and she offers you a cup of something bitter and warm. It kicks your tongue awake like pepper and dirt and memory, and then she says, "So you want to know how we really did it?" Not did it, did this. The secret acts, the unspoken touch, the midnight rituals that no one wrote down because they couldn't be explained. This is the part of the story that doesn't live in books or scrolls. It lives in breath, in hands, in dreams passed down, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, with a wink and a recipe that always left something out on purpose. She pulls a bundle from a woven pouch. It smells like cloves and smoke. Inside, a carved root, oddly shaped, polished smooth. Angelica, she says, shaped it while it dried, heated in milk, rubbed with goose fat. She says this casually, like she's talking about making bread. But it's not bread. It's a tool, or maybe it's a friend. You ask if it's for healing. She shrugs. Isn't pleasure a kind of healing? You've heard it before, from the widow, from the nun, from the woman with the beeswax tucked into her sleeve. But from this one, it sounds more like a spell than a question. She begins listing old names: St. John's candle, red root, moonkeeper wine. These are not modern brands of candle scents. They're ritual ingredients, some real, some maybe imagined, used by women to stir things, to bring warmth, to call the blood downward. She talks about women coming to her eyes wide with fear or frustration or exhaustion. They don't always say it, but I can tell. And what does she give them? Sometimes a bath of ginger and rose hips, sometimes a salve made with honey and ground violet petals, sometimes just a place to lie down where no one's watching. And once she says this while laughing into her bowl, a long feather and a set of instructions whispered in a mix of Latin, French, and nonsense. She came back the next day and brought me butter and a song. That's the kind of economy women like her worked in. Butter, secrets, peace. Now, let's be clear. Historically, cunning women were both revered and reviled. They were midwives, healers, and therapists before therapists existed. But they were also accused of witchcraft, especially when their remedies strayed too close to pleasure or autonomy. A woman who gave another woman the means to enjoy her own body without a man that was dangerous. And yet, they persisted. There's an archived court record from 15th century Wales where a healer was accused of giving herbal balm to a maiden who thereafter touched herself in the absence of sin. The phrasing is bizarre. What does absence of sin even mean? Scholars aren't sure. Some think the girl confessed that the act didn't feel sinful, that she had, through touch, found something holy, and that it had begun with the cunning woman's solve. That's the scholarly debate tonight. Were these women merely midwives working within the boundaries of what was acceptable? Or were they quietly pushing those boundaries, offering not just healing but liberation? Most records are vague innuendo, testimony blurred by fear and translation, but oral history says otherwise. The woman in the cottage opens a drawer beneath her hearth and pulls out a box wrapped in rabbit fur. Inside, an assortment of objects that look like ritual tools, but not for summoning spirits or hexing cows, small stones shaped to fit into palms, a phallus carved from redwood and worn with use, a cloth pouch filled with what she calls the warming powder, which turns out to be cayenne, mint, and powdered bark. She tells you to mix it with oil, only a drop, or you'll feel like a fox on fire. These weren't spells. They were instructions, but they had to be hidden, because any woman who taught another how to find joy alone, who gave her permission, material, space, was a threat to the church, to marriage, to silence. Still, the knowledge lived on, passed hand to hand, not as books, but as bundles, not as sermons, but as side-eyes and muttered advice and recipes scribbled on the backs of flour sacks. And often, pleasure was treated the same way as pain because the line was blurry. When a woman ached and couldn't explain why, the cunning woman knew. She would place a hand on the belly, stir her pot, and say something like, "What your womb wants is not a baby, it's you." And that was all. As you stand to leave, the woman in the cottage presses a small bundle into your palm cloth, wax, something soft and strange. "It won't fix the world," she says, "but it might help you breathe." You nod. You don't need the full spell, just the trust that someone long ago believed your pleasure mattered. You step back into the clearing, and the first birds are beginning to call. The sky has softened into blue, and you walk on, bundle in hand, into a world that still doesn't know how to talk about what women do in the dark, but where they have always known how to do it anyway. Because whether in a forest, a convent, a field, or a stone-walled bedroom, there have always been women whispering to each other, "Yes, you can." Dawn stretches slow and quiet across the hills, painting everything in pale gold and whispering away the mysteries of night. You've walked through gardens and graveyards, tapped fingers against tapestry threads and velvet hems, listened at the doorways of abbeys and cottages and dim-lit bedrooms. And now, as the sky blooms above you, you come to a place that's neither public nor private, but somewhere in between. It's the crossroads, not the metaphorical kind, the literal one where four paths meet and nothing is marked, but everything is remembered. There's an old wooden post here, moss curling around its base, and a low stone wall crumbling nearby. The wind carries no scent of incense or stew-just grass, earth, breath. It's quiet, but under that quiet, a hum, the kind you've started to recognize, not from a place or a person, but from memory, from everything the medieval world tried to cover, shame, sermonize, or erase. Because tonight, no, this morning, we're standing where the stories meet. You sit on the wall and begin to thread the pieces together. There's the noble woman with silk between her thighs, wrapped in fur and secrets. There's the nun who carved herself a psalm and tucked it into a kneeler. There's the herbalist with her root-carved remedies and rye instructions whispered by candlelight. There's Ada, the peasant woman with warm stone and beeswax, the garden's sacred hush, the poetry scrolled in Latin on the backs of hymnals, the stone bench beneath the vines, and all the things they never got to say out loud. But they did say them, just not in ways men knew how to hear. And that's the great, delicious twist of it all. Medieval women were never as silent as history pretended. They were just speaking in a language not everyone could read, a language of fabric and herbs, of gestures, of stitched innuendo and ritual bathwater, of margin notes and coated flowers, of fingertips and breath and pleasure. Because that's what this has always been about. Not lust, not scandal, not seduction, just this. A woman alone, feeling good, not because someone told her she could, not because a husband or priest unlocked it for her, but because her body remembered how. There's a moment right here, right now, where it's tempting to declare this a grand act of rebellion, a feminist triumph echoing across time. And yes, of course, there's power in that. There's defiance in every private moan, in every hidden touch, in every carved root passed from hand to hand like a relic of freedom. But it wasn't always rebellion. Sometimes it was just necessity. To be a woman in the medieval world was to be constantly handled, judged, instructed, and blamed. Your body was always under someone's ownership, father, husband, confessor, physician, priest. But your desire, your pleasure, that quietly, stubbornly remained yours. Even if you couldn't name it, even if you were punished for it, even if you didn't fully understand it, there was always that private moment at the end of the day when the chores were done, when the door was bolted, when you lay still, pressed your palms to your belly, and let the ache unspool. You think back to the confessionals. How many women sat behind that lattice work, voice trembling, and said things like, "I touched myself," or "I burned in the night," or "My dreams left me wet"? How many priests scolded them? How many doctors prescribed hot cloths and steam without ever admitting what it was really for? How many women walked away still not sure if they were healed or damned, but relieved either way? And yet it continued because pleasure, for all its risks, is a teacher. It tells you something about yourself that no one else can, that you are alive, that your body is yours, that sensation isn't shameful, it's sacred, that touch can be a prayer if no one else is listening. And for medieval women, that knowledge, quiet, unspoken, deeply felt, was the closest thing to freedom most of them ever knew. Here's your fringe fact for this chapter. In a small collection of 14th century folk songs from Flanders, there's one verse that seems utterly out of place. It's not a hymn. It's not a harvest chant. It's a song sung from the perspective of a woman at her spinning wheel, describing very coyly how the motion of the spindle beneath her skirt woke her from sleep. She repeats the line, and I turn the wheel again and again until the song ends in a soft hum. Was it just a joke? A dirty pun? Maybe, or maybe it was the only way she could put her experience into the public voice. That's the scholarly debate now as it was then. Were all these references, garden vines, coated stitches, bedside tools, warming powders really about self-pleasure? Or are we seeing what we want to see? Are we projecting 21st century ideas onto 13th century lives? But maybe that question misses the point. Maybe what matters is not how we interpret these moments, but that they existed, because evidence isn't just in ink. It's in what survives. Like a worn spot on a stone bench in a garden no longer tended, like a polished wooden shape found wrapped in linen beneath the altar, like the margins of a prayer book filled with wandering words, like a bit of fur sewn into the hem of a cloak, like the soft part of the mattress no one ever mentioned but never failed to use. And here now at the crossroads, with the sun rising and the earth stretching awake, you feel it. The enormity of all those tiny secret acts. Thousands of years, millions of women, one instinct to feel good, to come back to themselves, to leave a little mark on fabric, on parchment, in memory that says, I was here, and I was not ashamed. You rise slowly. The crossroads still quiet beneath your feet. The sky above you is pale gold. The world is wide open. And somewhere centuries ago, a woman is waking in her bed alone, her fingers already curling beneath the sheets. You've circled back now through shadow and silk, saints and steam, through bone-handled tools and half-spoken poetry, back into the steady breath of morning. You're no longer chasing a single story. You're standing in the middle of hundreds all overlapping like threads in a tapestry so worn that most people only see the holes. But you've seen the embroidery. You've run your fingers over the stitching, and now, in these final steps, you're holding the full weight of what they left behind. There's no grand building left to visit, no last hidden chamber or secret drawer, just a hill, a real one, not metaphorical, rising up over the valley where all these women lived and died and breathed and touched. The grass is damp underfoot, the sky is washed clean. You sit there, finally still, and begin piecing it together. Medieval women weren't supposed to know pleasure, not according to church law, not according to medicine, not according to the ink-stained hands of confessors and chroniclers who never once considered what it felt like to live inside a female body. But even so, women did know deeply, instinctively, creatively, desperately. They found ways. Maybe they didn't call it masturbation. Maybe they didn't even think of it as rebellion. Maybe it was just relief. Maybe it was survival. But there's no question that it happened again and again in nun cells, in peasant baths, on silk sheets, on packed hay, under moonlight, behind veils, through linen and wool and nothing at all. Sometimes in guilt, often in silence, but never without knowing. They knew. And what they knew, what they passed to each other through gestures and glances and recipes and riddles, wasn't just how to feel pleasure. It was how to claim something in a world that denied them nearly everything. One woman lined her shift with velvet and pressed it against herself while praying. Another steeped ginger and mint and slipped her fingers lower while her husband snored. Another carved her own relief, wrapped it in cloth, and hid it where no one would think to look. Another wrote in a dead language, disguising her climax as a vision of the Virgin. Another whispered to a neighbor that she had a new kind of warming salve, just a drop. But it changed everything. These weren't accidents. These weren't flukes. These were women inventing a language that didn't exist yet. A language of touch, of body, of ownership. Even if the words were borrowed from scripture or medicine or nonsense folklore, they made them mean something new. You think about all the times they were told, no, you may not own your body. No, you may not speak desire. No, you may not know what makes you feel alive. No, you may not want. No, you may not finish. But the body doesn't understand no. The body, when left alone, when given quiet and warmth and a single moment to breathe, remembers. It remembers pleasure like it remembers breath, something built in, something cellular, something older than scripture, older than sin. That's the fringe fact you leave with tonight, not a quirky object or dusty quote, but this, that many medieval women, even when robbed of language, found their way back to themselves through the one form of literacy they could never be denied: touch. Touch is protest, touch is prayer, touch is inheritance, and scholars still argue over the details. Was this really sexual? Was it truly subversive? Were they empowered or trapped? The truth is, yes, all of it. Pleasure in the medieval world wasn't a single thread. It was a not complicated, dangerous, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter, but always felt. Because here's what no scholar or priest or historian can fully erase: the fact that these women lived in bodies real ones, flesh that bled, ached, and pulsed with need. They weren't waiting to be rescued. They weren't dreaming of princes or confessions. Many of them were just trying to get through the day. But sometimes when the room was quiet and the door was locked and no one was asking anything of them, they remembered they were still allowed to feel good. And they did not because the world gave them permission, but because their bodies never needed it. You lie back now, the hill warm beneath you, the sun slipping over the edge of the world like a sigh. The air smells of dew and grass and something like the past, not in mourning, but in understanding, in a long exhale. The stories you've gathered, tender and awkward, sacred and sweaty, lonely and luminous, aren't gone. They were just waiting under dust, behind shame, beneath lace and leaves and law. And now you've heard them, which means, in some way, you've inherited them. The woman who pressed herself against her garden bench while pretending to pluck figs. The nun who carved her own release and dared to write it down. The peasant who warmed a stone and wrapped it in cloth like a secret lover. The cunning woman with her mint salve and feather spells. All of them. They're yours now. You get to remember them, not just as sinners or rebels or shadows, but as women who dared to feel good in a world that punished them for it. And maybe, when you're alone next, hands quiet, thoughts wandering, you'll think of them. Maybe you'll feel less alone. Maybe you'll press your fingers a little lower and smile because you're not the first, and you won't be the last. So, here we are. The night has faded, the sun has fully risen, and you've walked across centuries barefoot in some places, shod in others, listening to women who were never supposed to be remembered for this, for touching, for aching, for knowing themselves in ways history still isn't entirely comfortable with. You've sat with nuns and widows and midwives and dreamers. You've read between the lines of psalms and poems, traced the shapes of objects no museum labels clearly, and stood quietly in gardens where nothing was ever planted by accident. And maybe now, as you sit with all of this, you feel something else, not scandal, not even surprise, just recognition. Because the truth is, you knew this was possible all along. Deep down, you've always known that women, all women, have always found ways to return to their own bodies, no matter the rules, no matter the risks, no matter the absence of language, because pleasure is ancient, intuitive. It requires no permission, no choreography, no witness. But let's be honest, this story wasn't about discovery. It was about remembering. Remembering that even in the most controlled, silenced, guarded eras, there were always cracks in the walls, always hushed spaces where fingers found their rhythm and breath found its release, always a handful of curiosity hiding in the folds of a linen shift, always one woman showing another how to warm the oil just right, always laughter behind veils, always a whispered yes like that. And in remembering them, maybe you've remembered something in yourself too. So before you go back to your day, whatever it looks like, pause, take a breath, take another, and let this linger. Let the warmth stay with you, not in the form of facts or footnotes, but in the way your shoulders settle, the way your pulse slows, the way your body even now thanks you for listening. Because maybe, just maybe, she's been waiting for you to come home to her. Not with shame, with softness, with curiosity. With the same question they asked in gardens, in abbeys, on worn stone floors. What if I touched and nothing bad happened? What if I liked it? What if I came back to myself and it was holy? Thanks for walking this story with